Hel- Hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of the Anti-Oedipus reading group that I am trying to host at the very least. Um, Today, as in the last session as well, we'll be going over oh, wrong page, the second chapter in Anti-Oedipus, which is absolutely huge. And I am now realizing after the first session, I should have divided it and listened to everybody else. But that is psychoanalysis and familialism. I don't know how well that shows up for everybody. Um, and the Holy Family. I like the Holy Family title. That's why I put it in the title for the last one as well. Today, joining me, I have. Would everybody like to introduce themselves and I guess the names that they would like to be called today?
Yeah,
G'day.
go
Whoever
ahead.
wants to go first.
That doesn't matter.
I'm Brenton. I'm got into all this a couple of years ago. I'm kind of working on a project uh, putting Discordianism and Deleuze and Guattari into conversation.
Yeah, it's very cool. Taylor, just to give some order to it.
Yeah, of course. No worries at all. Britton, nice to meet you. And Foster, I think we're mutuals. Foster on Twitter. I can't remember. I think so, but I'd have to check. Anyway, I'm Taylor Adkins. I co-host of the Machine and Unconscious Happy Hour podcast. I've been reading Anti-Oedipus for 15 years. I always like to come back to it. And I've translated a little bit of Guattari, so I kind of feel like this is just one of those texts that I'm also interested in Deleuze. So this is one of those texts where we see Deleuze, sort of take a turn, if you will, with his conjunction with Guattari. And so it's always fun to come back to this kind of text. And I figured I would jump in and just listen along and maybe provide some sort of wall to bounce off of.
And Foster, the first, I guess, returning person for this group, particularly.
Hello. I'm a fourth year uni student here in the United States of America. I like philosophy. Uh, and yeah, that's about it. I enjoy continental philosophy, Deleuze and Guattarian philosophy. And here we are. Cameron making a rhizome, bringing all of us together.
Yeah. And I guess I'll introduce myself as well at the end. Especially since my channel's small, I'm not very big out there. But I'm Cameron. I am also a rising senior in college. I guess, a philosophy major for what counts here today. Um, and this will be my second reading of Anti-Oedipus, which I finished for the first time last summer with the help of Taylor Adkins and Cooper Cherry's seminar series on it as well. And I'm glad to have Taylor with us today because it was like I DM'd you earlier today. It was pretty important to have those extra dialogues on top of reading the book itself.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why Cooper termed them seminars. Maybe it's an homage to Lacan. Obviously, they aren't quite seminars; they're more dialogues, right? But I never pushed back on that. So in any case, I think there's a little bit. It's a little bit of a misnomer
They're very
in
productive
my head.
dialogues.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I know Cooper had just started reading Deleuze, and we had done a little bit of work together on Guattari's Machine and Unconscious. So going to Anti-Oedipus, I feel like, he had some of the Marx background, which was nice, and we had spent some time reading Freud before coming to this text, which I think one can do or one doesn't need to do. As you said, Cameron, just jump in, follow the flow or the flows, and just try to don't worry about every detail, right? Just kind of try to follow
Get the vibe
argument.
of the text. It's not Heidegger or
Mhm.
Husserl. You just need to get kind of it. This is what they're saying in this chapter in a very general way. But I did
Mhm.
kind of want to begin with a general kind of what I got from the last reading group. Not too much that I want to say. I don't want to make it super specific. But one thing that I think I think I DM'd you last week about it, Taylor. But what I really got out of the last reading group, it finally clicked for me, which is basically on the third reading of this chapter, pretty much during the reading group, how desiring production actually works. Like, I get that it was like a thing that they talk about in the first chapter, and they really laid the ground for it. But after my first reading, I was like, I get that there's desiring production, but like, how does it form? And it just going over the three syntheses as a group kind of finally it helped that little, like, I don't know, the flow finally clicked, and the knowledge was able to like actually make its way into the part that needed to process knowledge, or whatever the mind structures are in this framework. We only got to the fifth chapter, though. It took us about 2 hours to get there, but we only made it through the first two chapters in the three syntheses. Of course, you end up talking about the latter 4 chapters through those, but I guess that's kind of all I wanted to really bring to start us out. Is there anybody that really wants to talk about like the general themes they got out of their reread or their memory of reading this beforehand?
Man, where to begin, right? I mean, do you begin sort of in at the beginning of the chapter? Do you just sort of dive in? One of my favorite parts, if we want to look at, is on page 55. This is one of the, since I'm working kind of from memory and I'm just scrolling through the text. It's the bottom paragraph that starts off, and I'll just read. I'll give you guys a second to turn to 55 if you want, but it says, psychoanalysis is like the Russian Revolution. We don't know when it started going bad. We have to keep going back further to the Americans, to the First International, to the Secret Committee, to the first ruptures, which signify renunciation by Freud, yada, yada, yada. But I thought it was kind of interesting, and obviously we could keep reading this, but it's a long paragraph. But I thought it was interesting going ahead and linking some of the political machinations of Freud and his like circle around him, and all the drama that we see as he gets older and he's trying to keep kind of a grip on what psychoanalysis future will be. There's a similar type of political structure going on, or struggle, going on, as with, as they claim, with the Russian Revolution. So there's linking that political dynamic internal to psychoanalysis institutionally, I thought was a kind of interesting historical type of analogy. In any case, I know that doesn't really get into the conceptual themes of it, but it does pick up from where the first chapter leaves off, which is how psychoanalysis continues 19th century psychology in sort of bolstering bourgeois repression and the centering everything around the family. So it kind of continues that political dynamic and critique that they're finding in psychoanalysis.
Yeah. I have this really kind of interesting vantage point for having like the main 2 texts of Freud that I've gotten the furthest in. I finished the Ego and the Id, and I've gotten about third to a halfway through Dreams and Interpretation, the big book that he's known for. I forget what its full name is, or The Interpretation of Dreams.
Interpretation of Dreams.
Yeah. And you kind of do see there's a very big difference in, I believe, the 23 or so years between those 2 texts, because like later Freud is very interesting to read, but he is kind of the evil guy if you're doing good and evil for Anti-Oedipus. Whereas like one of the more analytic professors I have in my philosophy department really didn't like the wish assertion, because it just kind of he seemed in like a Popperian view, just kind of makes psychoanalysis more unfalsifiable. But if what dreams are and the interpretation of them, which I know we're trying to resist representation, but the interpretation is just a wish. Like, it is, the wish is so broad at that point. I don't know, like 10 or 15 years into Freud's work. And then just slowly over the next 20 or so years, like these new structures getting put in place. like it gets more universalized what the meanings need to be, and it just becomes kind of in what they bring up with Foucault's critique, and I believe the birth of the clinic for psychoanalysis. It basically just becomes Catholic oh my God, I'm just stumbling over myself. Catholic confession, like again, where you just get told kind of what everything means, and you don't really have. It doesn't really matter what you say at that point. It's just all kind of guilt, or
Right.
Psychoanalytic case, it's everything is Oedipus. I don't know. I could
Yeah,
be just going on a tangent here, but
I don't think so. I mean, this shows up later in the chapter in page, what is it? 118. And the reason why I was able to jump from page 55 to 118 is because you brought up this uh which I also brought up, Freud's older work, The Ego and the Id, which is itself a difficult text and kind of marks a number of shifts that have already been made from 1899, 1900, when Interpretation of Dreams first published, to the 20s when his later work comes out. And one of the things that reason why I could jump to page 118 in Anti-Oedipus was because I Control F searched for Al Capone, because they basically want to say that the first Freud, the early Freud, the exploratory, pioneering, revolutionary element, whereby desiring production was discovered, that's the side of Freud that they want to keep. But the other two parts of Freud, the other two aspects they want to critique and to get rid of, is the sort of classical Freud that reduces the unconscious to a theater, that kind of reduces to Oedipal theatrical representation, the return to myth, right? So they want to reject that part, but they also want to reject psychoanalysis as a kind of racket, right? This is why they kind of say Freud's Christopher Columbus on the one hand, a kind of Goethe, Sophocles on the other hand, but also an Al Capone. It's there's this racket of psychoanalysis in whether it be the exchange of money for sessions, or the way in which training goes on, the sort of stranglehold, if you will, on the interpretation of desire, right? Which I think you linked quite nicely to the confessional booth. It's those two aspects of Freud that they want to jettison, but they want to keep the kind of, in my mind, the revolutionary side of Freud, not just in the interpretation of dreams, but in 1905, for me at least, the 3 essays on sexuality, where Freud is kind of ruthlessly confronting Victorian sentimentality and morality with the fact that we're all perverts, right? We're all inevitably born polymorphously perverse. And so any sort of idea of normal sexuality is debunked from the start. That's the kind of revolutionary aspect of desiring production that they see Freud, the good side of Freud, because maybe Freud is kind of Janus face or triple face, right? There's kind of a good and evil to him, Cam.
Yeah, I remember reading The Ego and the Id, and it almost seems like the revolutionary facts of what psychoanalysis could have been haven't quite left yet. Because there is kind of, I remember taking an AP psychology class in high school, and what they taught in their little section on psychoanalysis and Freud didn't really match up to the structure that you find even in The Ego and the Id. Because like the ego is treated as like the thing everything forms around. The id forms under the ego, or in the super ego forms on top of the ego, and they kind of pressure him from both sides, or them from both sides. But what Freud is really describing is this like the plane of id, and then the ego forms the connection between the id and reality, and the super ego forms
right
out of the connection between the internalized social forces that the ego encounters and the id as well. And then a lot of other plays, but the id being the first thing, the id kind of to some degree being undifferentiated and not having this preference towards Oedipus yet. It seems like it could have been revolutionary if he was just willing to accept Oedipus as like this contingent factor. One thing we said in the last reading group is that I think one of the lines was like, you were only studying Austrian middle class bourgeois families. Of course, you were going to find Oedipus. But
and also preferring neurotic clientele instead of and not really delving into even when he reads Schraber, who is very important for Anti-Oedipus, as you saw in the first chapter, right?
Very
The solar
important.
anus, blah blah blah. I don't think one has to necessarily read the memoirs that Schraber published, although they're fascinating. But it is important material, at least to know of Freud's reading of the Schraber case, quote unquote, which he psychoanalyzes Schraber after the fact, based on the memoirs. Right? He wasn't a patient of his, and he wants to kind of neuroticize Schraber's paranoia, his quasi schizophrenic state. He wants to normalize, neuroticize it because that's the clients he's willing to take on. He doesn't like schizophrenics who treat words as things and vice versa, who don't allow names to stick to things in a certain way, right? Because when the schizophrenic says God, Freud wants to hear Father, and the schizo might say, okay, sure, but then he'll go back to saying God, right? And that's for Freud problematic, and it problematizes what Freud's trying to do with Oedipus, which is kind of scientific or scientistic basis of psychoanalysis, which he always strived for, but which has to then universalize certain things that you said, Cam, is contingent. And that's one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari cannot abide, because for them, it's kind of like their mantra is kind of always historicize, trying to find a trans-historical reality in Oedipus and a transcultural reality in it that's universal for them is just bad philosophy. It's bad science too. But in any case.
Would anybody else like to open up with kind of their general thoughts on the chapter as a whole before we kind of start trying to go in some first to ninth chapter order?
Yeah, kind of harkening back to what Taylor had started on page 55. There's another quote that kind of stuck out to me a few pages before that on 52. And it's the bottom paragraph of 52 and the first paragraph of 53, where they talk about desiring machines resisting Oedipalization, and how desiring production, the machines of desire that no longer allow themselves to be reduced to the structure of any more than two persons, and that constitute the real in itself, beyond or beneath the symbolic as well as the imaginary. Oh God, I forgot what Taylor quoted, but it was
about the Russian Revolution, or
the Russian
or about the racket.
It's the Russian Revolution. It was the Russian Revolution.
Yeah. How far do we have to go back to get to real psychoanalysis again?
Right. Where do things start going wrong in the history of psychoanalysis? Is it when Jung's kicked out? Is it when Bronx kicked out? Is it when Oedipus first rears its head in Freud's self-analysis? That's kind of analogy they're making with the Russian Revolution.
I'll just say this is
anyway. Okay, go ahead.
This whole book's a banger. I kind of struggle a little bit with this chapter in that it seems like it's the most attached to its original context. Like the 1, 3, and 4 seem like they're very you can read them into the world in a lot of different ways. And this one feels almost like it's a little bit harder to dislodge from its specific context in psychoanalysis, as a process currently ongoing in the society that it's in. I don't know. I haven't read this chapter for a little bit of a minute, but that's my kind of first, I guess, response when I think about this chapter.
I think you're totally right, and that's what makes it a little bit more difficult, is needing that ground in psychoanalysis to make some sense of it. The other chapters, as you said, kind of the first chapter maybe has a literary artistic axis if you want to frame it that way, although it goes beyond that. And then the fourth one kind of sets forth the project of schizoanalysis, while the third one gives us that not transhistorical, but it gives us the historical the historicizing of these different regimes, these different sociuses. So it has this whole anthropological domain that, as you said, can be taken in different directions. But this one really does feel rooted in their critique of Freud and their critique of psychoanalysis. And so it on the one hand, it can be skipped if that's not the most interesting thing. But on the other hand, it does give them their critical edge. And, you know, it shows psychoanalysis to be a target that's not something simply to be dismissed, but rather revolutionized or, sort of where, which pieces do we need to jettison? As I kind of said with Freud, you got to jettison that edible representative cultural side. You got to jettison the institutional racket side. Those are the two that I think Guattari is most concerned with trying to forge a new practice that is able to salvage some of the old from psychoanalysis, but get rid of the stuff that's problematic.
I think it's it reminds me of the conversation that's been on this server recently of like, oh well, what is the shape of Oedipus, does it change, all that sort of stuff, and it's like, again, with these other couple of chapters, there's kind of a very intuitive sense into where this fits into the world. And there's plenty of that in this second chapter as well. But definitely, like, I think there's a really intuitive response to sort of hearing about this book and what it does and what it's about, and saying, well, that's not an issue, really. What was the last time you went to a psychologist and they said, oh, well, the problem, have you heard of Oedipus? It's the problem of Oedipus. It kind of, it all archaic.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I think that's right that Oedipus, perhaps even by the time they were writing this, may have already been kind of going towards a downfall. Lacan says that he'd only spoken of the myth of Oedipus and not about the Oedipus complex, which is true in his later work. I mean, he's still, because he's writing over a period from the 30s to the 80s, right? So in his earlier work, he does at least reference the Oedipus complex, although he himself takes it in a different direction and takes castration in a different direction from Freud. It's much less literal, right? It's about our entrance into the symbolic and into language, blah, blah, blah. But, I do think that on the whole, their critique of Oedipus too dovetails with something of like Marx and Engels with their discussion of the family, of abolishing the family, right? That if Oedipus isn't taken as seriously in and of itself, the family, the familial structure, the bourgeois familial structure that we've kind of come to know and try to reinforce in the West through conservative values, blah, blah, blah. All that it still, I think, gives it some relevance, if that makes any sense.
The question I thought of, or an observation I thought of, was I do think it's particularly interesting kind of to point out the structure of where some of these chapters are, because the three syntheses kind of are it is desiring production. So I think the question needs to be asked, why are they not in the introduction to schizophrenia? Not as like an open question, it's kind of rhetorical. And it's because I think to some degree, as I mentioned in the last reading group, which I don't expect everyone here to have listened to it, it's a long video. It feels like what Deleuze and Guattari are doing here isn't just critiquing Oedipus, it's also giving a meta explanation to it as well, in that their view of desiring production can explain how Freud got to Oedipus, but thinks that it isn't explaining everything. I don't know what you three would think about that. That's just kind of an observation I got out of it, was that they want to be able to understand why Freud's patients and him himself might have these structures, but everybody else not necessarily does.
Considering that a lot of Deleuze's projects or works have been centered or focused on producing new, I would say that is, I would say that would be an accurate understanding. Like they're trying to understand and also push further, saying, hey, like this is where the downfalls are, but it's not that we can't garner something out of this.
I mean, Deleuze writes somewhere about finding good enemies, and I can't remember where it is. I wish I could, but he has this wonderful quote where he sort of talks about, you have to take someone you respect as your enemy, because you have to go into combat and kind of push them further. You can't sort of say, oh, well, this person's wrong about everything, and everything they say is stupid. You can do that, but it's a waste of time. They're taking people like Freud, like Lacan, who they have a certain, I think, respect for their work, but sort of, feel like there are fundamental missteps, and that they're trying to bring it onto a path that they see more value in.
And to kind of push this further, even on page 65, the middle paragraph on the bottom, they make the distinction between quantitative and qualitative factors of what do they call it? Is it producing economy? Celebrated, strong, mature ego. Oh, desiring economy. So it's like they're they say that the celebrated and strong, mature ego, the contract, the pact between the analyst and the ego, that is normal in spite of everything, except that there are qualitative factors in desiring economy, et cetera, et cetera. They go on, but it's like they're taking on the one hand, like we need to understand where we've come from so that we can go further.
That helps, I guess, a lot.
Yeah,
there.
I mean,
go ahead.
I mean, I would say with respect to your question, Cam, and just to maybe they do kind of note that they're I guess one of their points at the end of the first section of this chapter, right, is basically that there's no way, for them at least, Freud could be unaware that he was kind of forcing Oedipus onto the structure of the unconscious. They seem to be they don't seem to credit the idea that Freud could be unaware of trying to force everyone into this framework through making it a universal structure. So I think that's also a part of their critique, that there's a kind of, if not disingenuousness, there's a kind of I don't know, perhaps, again, and this is just my reading, perhaps a kind of desperation on Freud's part to lend a sort of scientific foundation to psychoanalysis by making it universal. Something like Oedipus or different stages of development, right? That he doesn't necessarily have it when he publishes 3 essays on sexuality in 1905, but as he revises it towards the end of his life, especially in the 20s, he's adding in the oral stage, which is supposedly first, right? The baby at the breast, which is the primordial prototype model. And then it's the anal stage. And then we get all the way up to finally the genital stage, right? Which is where we have adult sexuality. Freud doesn't really even seem, the Freud of 1905 with polymorphous perversity, it's hard to see how he would necessarily even agree with the Freud of the 1920s with these supposed universal stages. So, it's kind of, even within Freud and his work, chronologically, diachronically, there are these tensions and these, if not contradictions or paradoxes per se, at least these conflicting views. And even so, there's even a struggle going on with Freud about the direction to take psychoanalysis and the way to lend it a scientific credibility that he always wanted to kind of garner for it and to secure its future. So it wouldn't just be a kind pseudoscience or a kind of charlatanism at worst, right? So
Yeah, on that, it kind of I kind of want to go back to, I forget if Guattari says this in the first chapter or not. Um, I believe it's in one of those sections where you can kind of obviously tell that Deleuze was not writing this paragraph or something. But it's kind of the show me your desiring machines, I think, line. It might have been in this chapter, it might have been in the first. Hell, it could probably be in the fourth as well. But it does kind of, like, at a praxis level, like a Marxist, like, if you want to do some like anti-fascist, like, try and break this psychoanalytic or psycho I don't know, political holds that fascism has on the brain, it does seem that schizoanalysis would make it much, I guess, if both could be true processes of doing it, schizoanalysis would be harder and take a lot longer to do than these generalizations that psychoanalysis is able to do. Because in the Deleuze-Guattarian framework, every single person has a different framework of desire. They desire nearly almost, or not completely differently, but at some level, something in the process is different from everybody else. I don't know if that's something you would agree with, to Taylor. For I mean, I'm just starting with Guattari with your translation. So you kind of can speak to that a little bit better than I can. But I mean, my interpretation of it is, I keep going back to that clip where Deleuze says that if he didn't go into philosophy, he would have gone into law, specifically jurisprudence, because he wants to handle everything at a case-by-case basis. There is no general law. If you really want to truly understand how people interact in society, you have to interact with the subject as they are, not as some universal category could ever solve.
Yeah, I guess I'll be quick. I mean, Freud seems to know this too, that a case by case basis you can't just bring in a stock phrase or a stock, even, I mean, you might have a general framework for a method, but he seems to know that case by case, you have to work on the material that's provided by the analysand under question. With Guattari, he uses an interesting, because your question about Freud, even late in his life, wrote a text called analysis terminable or interminable, right?
Yeah, they talk about it in the last chapter.
Yeah, and he is worried about this fact that, like with the Wolfman case, which he wasn't able to actually fully solve, that took one of his students to do later in the Wolfman's life. But in any case, Freud is kind of worried about how it can become. There's a way in which, almost like the going to see the psychoanalyst, can become its own symptom. It can become its own addiction. And Guattari takes up this notion in Gangs of New York, this little essay he has in Chaosophy, where he likens, or I think about it in terms of likening it to analysis. He's talking about how people are moved from heroin to methadone, but basically you're replacing one drug for another. And for Guattari, and I take him to be thinking about psychoanalysis in this light, he doesn't want analysis to be interminable. He wants it to be kind of like a process where you slowly wean the subject off of analysis in the same way one can, wean, not wean, you can sort of get off of drugs and not just replace one with another with a permanent addiction. So in terms of schizoanalysis taking longer, it's hard to say. Again, that would be something where Guattari would not want to.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, interpreting at like a global scale, because like for each individual person you have to start at zero, whereas Freud can just be like, okay, how do we get to Oedipus with you?
Right. Or how do we get you through the Oedipus complex? Or how do we get back to the childhood trauma that's singular for your case? Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I think with Guattari, what's interesting is, for them, the unconscious is productive and it's not expressive. So it's not going to, the outcomes or the values of the sessions aren't necessarily just going to be the analyst behind a couch listening. For Guattari, and this goes to your point about show me your desiring machines. He writes somewhere, I can't remember exactly, it could just be in an interview, where he's talking about how with his patients, at Laborde, where he's dealing with psychotics and schizophrenics, which is something that most psychoanalysts weren't really doing. And he was trying to do experimental things, which you guys have probably heard about, like with the grid and these other things. But he talks about how someone whose life had always been working outdoors with their hands, he might try to introduce new semiotic components into their universe, like through different reading methods, different writing methods, different ways of maybe even having them paint, having them draw. So you're sort of introducing these diagrammatic elements, these different components of expressivity. I'm using this in a different way because we're talking about producing something, not just talking for talking's sake. But someone else who maybe had been a writer or who had been working in an office cubicle for all their life and suddenly has a crisis, he might introduce them into different types of athletic activities or sports, give them a bike and go on a or go walk out in the woods. We're what Guattari's trying to do is kind of expand their virtual universe of value in order to perhaps try to shake up the deadlocks that they find themselves in. And so, in that sense, the talking cure would just be one of the tools and not the main weapon, as it is in psychoanalysis.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm trying to resist the urge to talk about Asteroid City by Wes Anderson because I think it might be pertinent, but it came out like 2 days ago. Um, so I really don't want to spoil that one. But
Yeah, no spoilers, please, because I think my wife that might be a movie I could take her to. She's a big Wes Anderson
it's
fan,
really
so.
good. I'm gonna say I'll do a Substack article on it in like a week, particularly on the ending that I think could be very pertinent in like desiring production. Um, that's just kind of an announcement. I'll leave it off till some people can go see it. Great movie though. If people have it in theaters nearby, go see it. Especially if you love like meta filmmaking. Um, that's as far as I'm going to be willing to go with what the story actually consists of. Um, but yeah, I do think it is I guess to discuss what you actually were saying, Taylor, it is kind of what Guattari does seem to be outlining so far and how it would actually apply. It's not, you can't just trust that like what is it, the couch and the analyst. You actually have to go in and do something. I think that's kind of the Marxist elements that they're adding in there, is that, or the materialist dialect, they're not materialist dialect, materialist psychiatry, is that real material changes will change the psychology as well, because the real material changes have influenced the psychology up till now. That's kind of what I've gotten so far out of my reading of Wilhelm Reich, in the mass psychology of fascism, is that people come to these political reactionary sentiments out of some degree like real material forces. Sometimes it's family, sometimes it is ideals. I think he leans a little bit too much on mysticism, and I think Deleuze and Guattari agree with that position. Um, but ultimately, it is to a degree economic and political forces in the real world do have a play on how people think. It's not ingrained at a child. It is kind of in this social field and changing how people interact with the world, as you seem to have pointed out Guattari tried to do. Does ultimately change how they view their own psychology, or it changes the structure of their psychology to some degree. Hopefully that's kind of on the same page. I might have gotten a little off.
No, no. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting, this is at the bottom of, I think, page 62.
Yeah.
This is one of the quotes that I really like, that you can see Guattari writing about this in Psychoanalysis and Transversality, published in, I believe, the same year of Anti-Oedipus, although some of the articles are included in that predate, obviously, that year. But I won't read the whole quote, but they're basically, and this, I assume Guattari is writing this, but I know that they don't want us to make that distinction, so I'll just say this feels very close to some of the stuff that Guattari is writing about. But Guattari is Deleuze and Guattari are sort of juxtaposing individual fantasy and this imaginary dimension of the death instinct, right? Dying for the army. What matters if the general dies? The army is immortal. Versus what they say, and this starts at the very last sentence of page 62, the revolutionary pole of group fantasy becomes visible on the contrary, and the power to experience institutions themselves as mortal, to destroy them or change them according to the articulation of desire in the social field by making the death instinct or the death drive into a veritable institutional creativity. For that is precisely the criterion that distinguishes the revolutionary institution from the enormous inertia which the law communicates to institutions and an established order. As Nietzsche says, churches, army, states, which of all these dogs wants to die? And, I've talked about this in the, on the podcast before, because this was one of my favorite ideas of Guattari. And Guattari, actually, I feel like he participated in this because he was constantly, moving in and out of groups. He was constantly kind of creating different little like research groups with different journals and collapsing them when they kind of stopped fulfilling a certain vision. But in any case, when Guattari is talking about injecting institutions with the death drive, what he's trying to consider is specifically even psychoanalysis and potentially schizoanalysis, how they could participate in this always mortal formation that means that they aren't trying to fulfill this will to self-preserve at any cost, even at the cost of ossifying, at the cost of becoming a racket, right? Like I brought up earlier, right? So when Guattari is trying to think of these social collective institutions as incorporating the death drive and potentially not trying to immortalize themselves, I think that that's not necessarily a negative criterion where we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of temporary alliances that can reform or recreate elsewhere and elsewise. I find that to be very fruitful thinking from Guattari, kind of thinking through finitude in a way that doesn't have to jettison things like, consistency or persistence differently. Because one can, I think for Guattari, it should be kind of an outburst of crystallization rather than this slow ossifying, true death, if you will, of institutions that just want to perpetuate themselves.
Yeah, it kind of feels like it's kind of like the externalization of what I was trying to ask you about desiring production last week, in that like desire forms because it functions. These groups originally form because they have some sort of function, but the problem is that when that function gets lost, the desire or the desiring machines are still kind of attached to the body. They haven't left. I guess it's the schizophrenia that they talk about. I did the term like liberated schizophrenic for like what they seemed as some kind of ideal, would just be able to tear the desiring machine off when it stopped being useful. But for the average person, the desiring machine continues. The way we conceive love continues, or something else, how we conceive these different structures, friends, families, etc., through desiring machines continues past the point where it serves this function, maybe as a child or so, and becomes kind of more neurotic as it enters into, I guess, teenage or adulthood or so, where what used to help maybe us as a 3-year-old, what used to function at an 8-year-old, just starts becoming, I guess, more, I don't know the proper Deleuze Guattarian term. It ends up, I guess, keeping us in the same place, hurting us, etc. And I feel like this is kind of the same thing for these external groups that they're talking about, and that we kind of get used to going to the same, being in the same group, associating our, I guess, being with the groups that we're associated with, and the activities we perform. And at one point, they might have had a good function. That's why we might have taken them on. What was that? Oh yeah, we get used to the same. Yeah, that there's a comfort in believing that our desiring machines are the ones that we should hold. I guess is kind of what I get out of that. That's why we keep them attached.
Guattari sometimes calls this like a black hole or a semiotic hole.
What's his
that
name?
we get kind of stuck.
Yeah, I think they mentioned the word black hole at one point. I don't know if it was kind of about this or not.
This is particularly, I'm thinking in the Machinic Unconscious, where he's reading Swan, sort of the main character, if you will, of the first few books, particularly the first book. But he will try to become an artist, and through this love affair and these other things, he'll get kind of caught in a semiotic black hole of this um, unproductive repetition, and will fail at this. Whereas the narrator himself, towards the end of the work, who seemingly is veering towards the same conflicts, the same internal struggles, the same deadlocks, the same black holes, is able to overcome that through the incorporation of Von Tweel's little phrase, this little kind of melody, if you will, this little refrain, from a made up contemporary artist, who it'll kind of rearrange his sort of unconscious ecology and allow him to bypass this black hole that we've already seen Swan get sucked into. So, I mean, I think this is why for Guattari and for Deleuze, right? The refrain, for example, is this way in which consistency forms out of chaos in order also to ward off chaos. And so, I think that's anyway. That was just, since you were looking for the phrase or for the conceptual thing, I think.
And it could be from the Machine Unconscious, because I have kind of been reading the two in parallel with each other. Doesn't anybody?
I think one
sorry.
thing, if I bring this, because I find it so fascinating. This is on page 66, and I'm not sure if you guys made anything of this, but when they bring up Andre Green, who's a pretty, I wouldn't say well-known psychoanalyst, but he's got some good work. A lot of it's untranslated, but that's I'm not going to be able to tackle it. I've got too many ideas for stuff to translate. But in any case, they're talking about these different forms of transference and different libidos, right? It reminds me of Goldilocks. One libido is going to be too sticky, where one libido is going to be too runny, and you need to have a libido just right to let the cure take hold, right? I wonder if you made anything about this, because I think this is related back to what I mentioned about Freud not really liking schizophrenics or psychotics, right? That those are, for him at least, I think those are the ones most resistant to the psychoanalytic cure, the talking cure, because they're are not allowing names to stick to things or something like this, right? That it's what all of this is without consequence, since the analysis slides off the couch like water off a duck's back. That would be the two runny transference or whatever, right? Not the analyst can't make the transference stick.
And before we go on that, thanks for Foster for joining. He will be.
Yeah, thank you, Foster.
No problem. Catch you guys later.
Yeah, I don't have really any highlights here, so I didn't get much out of that except for the final sentence. For this reason, interpretation is always retrospective as the perceived meaning. So that's what this meant.
Mm-hmm.
Brenton, do you have anything on this section?
I've got a different version of the text. So can you just
I don't have
a little bit more? The first line of the paragraph and the
first
chapter
section. This section, I believe, is the second section, right?
Wait, I'm gonna do it backwards by paragraph. 1, 2, 3.
I think it's in the 3 texts of Freud section.
It's the
fifth, and towards the end of.
It should be the second or third to last page of that section, 5th to last paragraph. If they keep the same paragraph structure, which I believe they do.
What is the issue in this?
In some fine pages, Andre Green recently took up the question again, about the qualitative flows of the libido, right? So, but yeah, the first few words of the paragraph in some fine pages. So you got like type 1 type of libido that's too sticky, sort of a resistance to transference, and then type 2, which is too runny, and it's more obsessional than hysteric. In any case, I suppose I only brought this up because I found it interesting about how you need to have the porridge is not too hot, not too cold, but it's just right in order for sort of the Freudian manifold, the framework to work, right? You need a libido that's just consistent enough to allow for names and global persons to like stick together, and that's where you get Oedipus, right? You can get the global person of mommy, daddy, me, and get that triangle if you have a libidinal viscosity.
Yeah, I think that when I first went through this part here, I didn't sort of do a lot with it. Like
It's okay.
didn't sort of like for our little reading group, we didn't come up with a lot. I think it's really interesting and it's really good. I think it the first thing that comes up to me is that it really ties into this, I guess, the way that especially with a lot of stuff, the way that a lot of things get talked about, the way that it's kind of incumbent on the person who's receiving treatment to kind of receive treatment properly, opposed to like questioning the process or questioning the way things are done. Everything comes back to this kind of spectrum of personal responsibility, and that's sort of the only thing that jumps out at me for that part.
No, I mean that's fine, and I think that this is one of those things where it's probably it's setting up the next few sections. I think it's kind of uh, um because I think that it just goes to show like the cure of psychoanalysis really does require, it's almost like Freud is seeking out his patients instead of the other way around, right? You need to have this ideal patient for things to work. And I guess I would suggest, Cam, if you want, we could maybe start looking at the next section.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the chart that I was using last time. I mean, I know we can speak beyond it, but it was really kind of helpful to just be able to put all three on the same sheet. And if I can pull that up, I can share it with the both of you. Let me see if I can find it again. But yeah, I guess to open this up, this is probably the easiest of the three syntheses. The connective one is. Let's see if I can pull this up here. Share screen. Yeah, I know at least Taylor has seen this before because you commented on it.
Oh yeah,
and how it was missing some things.
Well, but yes, this is pretty good. I think definitely if you have it, Cam, I would suggest sharing this to the group Discord because I do think it's
Foster
pretty
put it in
helpful.
a while back.
Okay, good. Yeah,
I can reply to it.
I think it's helpful.
Yeah, but this is kind of I think the series part is probably the most helpful, especially for at least connective and disjunctive, kind of the like having it just kind of spelled out as the and blank blank and then and then and then and then et cetera et cetera et cetera, does kind of make it a lot more concrete as an idea than just kind of reading through this chapter with no idea what we're talking about. But this I think I was saying last time that the few pages of proofs that I have read from the first book, and I forget what the entire series is called, but like I've read the first
last time.
Yeah, I've read the first 12 pages where he's trying to go to sleep and turning over and over again, and it reminds him of being at his grandmother's. And I'm like, okay, I'm 12. I'm like, last summer I got 10 pages in, but that is the connective synthesis pretty much. It is just one thing leading to another. Whether that just be me looking around or whether that just be my mind racing, going from It is this like, I guess, a rhizomatic synthesis? It's just going where it leads.
Potentially, I mean, they haven't yet formulated the idea of the rhizome, but I do think potentially, because in A Thousand Plateaus, they'll want to challenge the
That's the introduction.
kind of Heideggerian. Yes, they want to challenge the kind of privilege of being, which is for them in French, it's est, right?
Oh,
And
ile.
privilege T, which is A, right? So there's a kind of interesting homophonic joke there, but they want to privilege the and over the is,
Ah.
the connective in that sense over
A.
what's the substantive or over the copula, right? For them, the true connective is the and as D in the graph.
So A over etre. Yeah. I mean, I do, I guess, like that because I've always kind of ascribed to a metaphysical view of becoming. I've just never been able to express it before I started reading these guys. Um, of course, when Deleuze is like the third philosopher you grasp upon, it is kind of hard to have a coherent philosophy quite yet. Um, but yeah, we can just kind of slowly move down this chart as we go through the chapters. Was there anything that either of y'all saw in the third chapter that I guess we haven't gone over with this and yet, that is like you believe of particular importance?
Yeah, I mean, this one thing I could bring up, Cam, that you kind of
Yeah.
asked me a little bit about was about global persons. This is on the bottom of page 70. So this would be for, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This will be in the sixth. Wait, no,
I can
where is
count
it?
one,
I lost
two,
it.
three.
I thought it was in the sixth paragraph.
5,
It's
6.
this line's
Yeah, 6. I think
an easier way for me to
the
find.
opposition here is between two
I got it.
uses.
Yeah, that's the 6th
Okay,
paragraph.
so towards kind of the middle of that paragraph, they say, but a strange reasoning leads one to conclude that since it is forbidden, that very thing was desired. In reality, global persons, even the very form of persons, do not exist prior to the prohibitions that weigh on them and constitute them any more than they exist prior to the triangulation with which they enter. So I was just kind of trying to, well, two things here. One would be they do not agree with Freud, who kind of concludes that because a thing is prohibited, that means it was desired. They don't think that that's a fair cop, right? Because they want to say that the prohibition, in fact, distorts and demeans and sort of wants to disparage desire in prohibiting it. So it creates this distortion, which I think we see in this chapter later talked about, right? Or maybe it might be in the beginning of chapter of the third long chapter. But in any case, the thing about global persons that I was just trying to say to Cam, and what I was saying was missing from this graph was that each of the syntheses has illegitimate uses, and one of which is kind of Freud's conclusion from prohibition, which is also, I think, a whole, for Deleuze, there's a whole history of lack as a concept in the history of philosophy that he wants to he wants to critique because it privileges the negative. But in any case, global persons like daddy, like mommy, or even, Oedipus, me, they are the thing that you need in order um, for names and persons to stick together. You need that. Otherwise, if you use the syntheses and the connective one in particular legitimately, global persons fade away. But also in the synthesis, right? Because they use the example of Nietzsche, like every name in history is I. There's this sweep of an R conjunctive synthesis that doesn't end in an identity that would be to allow for these names to be ascribed to them. So I think in that sense, it's important for understanding that it's the illegitimate use of the connective synthesis that gives us the starting point for having triangulation, for having these courts critique of the part object that Melanie Klein wants to put forth, right? Because for them, that makes the object, partial or not, into a lost piece of a totality. So they want to critique complete objects. They want to critique global persons. Global persons would be just kind of like complete persons rather than
Oedipus.
yes, Oedipus, but also I think for Deleuze, if you start with the complete person, if you start with the individual, you can't understand individuation. You can't understand how singularities in a transcendental field coalesce. In a pre-individual milieu coalesce to make these larval subjects. You start with molar. How can you get to the molecular? How can you betray the molecular, etc. Right?
Yeah, I don't want to go too far off, but this kind of leads me back to where the final, I guess, little bit that they had on Reich on the bottom of page 29 in the last chapter that was kind of leading me after the last couple reading groups, in that they really scorn, or the one thing they critique of Reich, or Wilhelm Reich, is that he kind of still maintains the distinction between reason and desire. In my interpretation of that, which I don't know if interpretation is the right thing to do to lose, but I kind of, the way I guess internalized that was reason is a product of desire. Everything is desire. Reason must be a product of it as well. So what is the desire that creates reason? It is, I think in some degree it is kind of this desire both for reality to exist, the reality we exist in. We want to believe that the way we've been desiring, the way we've been interacting with the world is true, because if else, then everything is going to kind of fall apart. And because of that, it's also kind of this desire for coherence at the same time. That's kind of what gives the logic to reason itself, at least in my view. Therefore, you have these, I guess, kind of incomplete ideas. You have the prohibition against incest, and there's the what of it, but there's also the why of it. You have to justify it, because in so many frames of mind, there's this, I guess, desire for justification for everything. Everything has to have this reasonable, logical base to it, and you by that you
principle sufficient reason.
Yeah, you kind of fill in the gaps there. Whereas the prohibition of incest isn't this positive societal structure, as we discussed in chapter 3, where it creates these rules that allow for alliances between communities. It must be this natural desire that we're kind of blocking out. I don't know if that's kind of the best way to go about it, but that's kind of, I guess, where the motor started going for me for this particular quote.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that. Go ahead, Britton.
I was gonna say that reminds me of some of the Spinoza stuff. You have two bodies coming into contact, and then what is produced, what comes out of that contact, out of that process, doesn't necessarily resemble either of those two forces. It's the same as you can't the Marx thing. You can't the bread doesn't tell you anything about where the wheat was grown. It's the things don't necessarily have these causes that are I guess rationally identifiable from just looking at what has emerged.
Yeah, I think that's a good part. I guess kind of connect it. I do like the me saying that reminds me of, and then you saying that reminds me of, because it's like, oh, we're finally thinking rhizomatically, just one connection after the next one. But yeah, it does kind of seem like, I don't know if I interpret the Marx quote a little bit differently, but me trying to kind of explain how we interact with the economy, because every commodity, I guess, to some degree, has this connection to all these different processes. Whereas we only experience it at this kind of individualistic level. We go to Target, we buy the product, and we bring it home, and then that is our experience of the product. The bread was always bread to us. It just showed up at the shelf at that time. You don't see the labor that goes into it, the wheat that goes into it. We're kind of partial towards our own experience rather than seeing outside of it. And I'm probably going in a slightly different direction than you. There anything you would like to add to that, I guess, at all, to make sure I don't get too far off?
Not to that. I know that Taylor was going to say something, so I'll let him say that. But then I wanted to. There's something else I'll mention just after that.
You can go ahead then.
I was just going to say, like, the thing that helped me kind of get a handle on that whole idea of, because it's prohibited, doesn't mean it was desired. I kind of, the prohibition sets a new series of relations, and my thought there is, if you have a shop to go and get your groceries and so on, you've got people who need to eat, and then you've got a bunch of food all in one place. But then the rule is no shoplifting. And, that sort of was a thought that helped me make sense of it, because it's like, okay, it's not that everybody wants to steal. It's that by actually creating this rule about shoplifting, you produce a series of relations. You actually, this rule, no shoplifting, only makes sense insofar as people have an identity as and other people have identities as owners, and products have an identity as commodities, and money has this function of dating. Like, actually presenting the rule doesn't just stop something that was about to happen. It actually creates a particular set of relations, of interconnections that otherwise wouldn't exist. And it's the thought that, I feel like it's probably, thinking about it now, I think that it's not a perfect allegory, because I think that there's a little bit more nuance there in what they're saying, but that was kind of the thought that got me able to make sense of it in the first instance.
I do think that is kind of a really good, I guess, lifting off point, because everything is, they're coming from Marx and Freud and trying to, I think one of the things that Taylor and his co-host Coop kind of mentioned in one of their either seminar 2 or 3 on this particular chapter, or the second or third seminar overall, and the first and second on this chapter, is that kind of Marx fills in the critiques of Freud, and Freud fills in the critiques of Marx that they have. Of course, there's so many other people that they're dealing with that that's kind of a reduction to some degree, but Marx's like focus on production is kind of very important here, especially with how historical materialism kind of functions, in that it does kind of, by the time you get to Deleuze, there isn't like this negation. These forces aren't acting against each other. It's just kind of everything ends up being productive of a new state of relations that slowly reinvest away from the old way of being. So new laws create new relations, new technology creates new relations. It's never kind of dialectically opposed or anything. It's just kind of this new thing creates new ways of functioning in reality, and those new ways of functioning create new thoughts, and those new thoughts create maybe new inventions. I guess is my understanding of Marx thus far. And I do think it's a good lifting off point to view everything positively, and that the prohibitions that they speak of aren't just kind of blocking off the natural, like, oh, this is you, but only this amount of what you desire is acceptable. It's kind of, this is where you start off 0 point. Of course, you're going to have desire, but you have to invest that desire in the real world. And that an investment is going to come from these interactions you have with the world, whether that be the laws, the rules, that some people might try to naturalize and believing that incest is some natural desire we have, rather than just prohibiting it because we either A, don't want people doing that because I don't know, we don't want incest babies, or we want to preserve this alliance, or something else. I forgot where I was going with that. Sorry about that. But everything in there is it's productive. The laws that we're talking about now, like you said, create this new series of relations because we're just putting, I guess, connecting. I don't know which of these syntheses it is exactly. Would you, or is there anything else you wanted to talk about for this chapter exactly? I think Taylor will be back in a few minutes.
This part of this chapter, the connective.
If not, we can go into the disjunctive. That one's a pretty interesting chapter as well.
Yeah, I don't have anything else for the connective. I find that, I don't know, that this particular element of it, like the three syntheses, kind of leaves me cold. Like it's one of the parts that I have the least resonance with.
It clicked for me 3 days ago, so do not feel bad. This is my second reading, and this section clicked on me 3 days ago. In the middle of the reading group was kind of when I finally got what they were talking about. So do not feel bad at all.
Well, it's so I don't feel like I have too much difficult understanding it. It's just, you know, some things I come across, you know, the schizoanalysis or whatever, I'm like, wow, you know, my mind sort of goes racing. I'm like, I see so many things that we could do with that. You know, there's so much application of it. I see it reflected in so many places. And I don't know, I just, the syntheses, I just kind of go like, yeah, okay, yeah, I see your point. And there's not a lot else is sparking off, you know, it's kind of, it makes sense, it's fine.
Yeah.
And then it just doesn't, I'm not seeing all these sort of connections and possibilities the way, you know, that other parts of the discussion really wake things up.
I think if anything, it's just kind of, it feels like a technical guide more than anything, I guess, to some degree, mixed in with their critique of Freud here, in that it's a technical guide to like, how is desire produced? That's the kind of question that they're kind of asking with this. Of course, the chapter on schizoanalysis is going to be much more interesting with that once it has established how desire is produced and how desire becomes manifest in these three chapters here, or in the section as a whole. But it is kind of like you got to kind of bog through it. You kind of have to understand what these three are, and then you can understand, like, in the process of that, you understand how they can go wrong, etc. And then you get to schizoanalysis, and they're like, okay, now you get to the interesting part that you kind of got the grounding for earlier. Do you feel that way, or is it just you got to read more?
No, I think that's definitely pretty much where I'm at.
Yeah, it's the ground for the more interesting stuff.
Did you have anything on disjunctive? Because there's something I was going to mention about
Go ahead with connective. I kind of want to preserve some order. So if you have one last thought on connective, then go ahead.
No, I'm jumping ahead to consumption.
Oh, conjunctive.
So go.
Well, if I kind of feel like if you want to go ahead to do a little bit on conjunctive, we can, just because what I want to bring up with disjunctive. Well, I want to wait for Taylor to wait for disjunctive, and then we can come back to it. So go ahead and skip to conjunctive. Go ahead. Oh, you're here?
Definitely go to conjunctive. Yeah, I'm here. So we can jump back to disjunctive. Go ahead, Brendan. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I was just going to say that this document was really helpful because this language of consumption kind of does my head in a little bit. And I sort of read this document and I've gone, oh, it's, you know, in my head now, I'm just flipping it to digestion or digestive instead of consumptive, which I guess is the same sort of thing. But the way this is written, it sort of feels like, oh, all these things that have been left on the BWO, all these marks, all these whatevers. Now we get to just chew on it and digest it, and kind of, the the little feelings that the beans and sausages are making in my tummy, once I've lit it all up, that keep coming back as sensations. It's like, okay, they're the little reminders of, oh, that's who I am. I'm the guy who ate the beans and sausages, or I'm the guy who got attacked by a spider, or I'm the guy who is really handsome and good looking, everyone likes me, or I'm stupid and useless and everyone hates me, or whatever. It was just, that's the only thing I was going to say. It's just like a little thing there that reading that document sort of, I've sort of, I mean, you could tell me if this is like not a very good way to think of it, but yeah, that thought of like, oh, it's the digestion. It's kind of, now we've built up all of this stuff, and now it's those things that remain, continue to kind of have their effects and interplays, and their role in producing a subject.
I mean, I do think they mean it in that way as one of the ways of reading it. I also think they have Marx in mind. The way that he's analyzing production and circulation of commodities and their consumption, right? We as consumers going to the mall, blah blah blah. So, yeah, I think that's part and parcel of it too. Is that kind of a little bit that Marx notion. And also, interestingly, right, in French, they have one word where we have two words, right? Their one word, consumption, means both consumption and consummation, like of a marriage. So, it's kind of interesting, a little bit of a wordplay there. So it is fairly diverse, complex, but I don't think it rules out your reading at all.
It makes me think. So I know that we're getting in the weeds on this one, which is we're trying not to do, but it actually, that reminds me of that use of towards the end. I'm disrupting all your order here, but this language of I can't remember exactly what it is, but like they talk about bringing off. It's like to bring off. I think two different things. I can't remember what it was, but kind of that language of like an orgasm. It's like it's that consummation. It's that moment where we're not doing foreplay anymore. It's kind of, it's all erupting into being. It's erupting into kind of a sense of certainty, bring off castration, bring off frustration, and it reminds me of actually the work of A.O. Spare, who the occultist, who sort of talks about, you want to hold all this energy and let it continue to be productive, as opposed to letting it erupt, because then it's kind of it when it erupts, it becomes defined, it becomes a thing. Which again, I think there's also a connection there, because he was influenced by these Eastern traditions, and you can definitely see that that influence on D&G at points.
Yeah, and it also shows up in Lyotard's Liminal Economy towards the end, where he's discussing ancient Chinese erotic practices, right, where the male has to hold in the semen or the yang in order to use the yin, in order to suck up the feminine essence, blah blah blah. So yeah, I mean, I do think that's part of it. It's just how the circulation of enjoyment in it's what one of the concrete examples they give, which could be added to this, and then we could go back to disjunctive can, is the baby's burp after feeding at the breast, right? That's a little bubble of the enjoyment of consumption, of the consumptive synthesis.
One thing I kind of wanted to mention here is, I guess one of the few things I did get out of my first reading of Anti-Oedipus was that it almost seems in this, I guess, materialist psychiatry, if you want to call it, or schizoanalysis, content slowly becomes a structure in a way. I don't know necessarily how to actualize, I guess, that comment, but like the content we consume, not necessarily like YouTube content, but like everything we interact with, it slowly, as we grow up, makes its way into being structure. And the conjunctive synthesis, in my view, is kind of how that happens, because you get the and with the connective synthesis. And as we'll talk about the disjunctive synthesis, you get this choice that that feels kind of like how we invest desire, the either or. And then this is kind of we're consuming stuff that comes in through the connective synthesis and is recorded. But that those two processes, I guess, kind of to some degree are part of the conjunctive synthesis. I don't want to claim way too much at this moment, but this seems the process that the content we get through these two, and how they, I guess, enter into the assemblage that I guess I am, slowly make their way into, I guess, remaking the whole assemblage, creating new flows, etc. I don't know if that's, I guess, the right way to take this completely, because I think a big thing I latched onto was their reference to Marx, particularly the introduction to the critique of political economy, where Marx talks about, I guess, the four parts of, I don't know if it's the market or political economy, and I can remember three of them, which is production, distribution, and consumption. But there's not really, with Marx, he talks about there's not really a starting point there. And with Deleuze and Guattari, we're mostly talking about production and consumption here, just those two. There's not really a clean starting point for either, because there's no production without consumption, and there's no consumption without production. And I kind of feel like that's what they're taking like you said, they're taking a big part of Marx in this chapter, but it's kind of that cycle that the conjunctive synthesis is. The consumption becomes production or justifies producing more, and production is, or I don't know if is that the whole thing. Production allows the possibility of consumption at all, or vice versa, mattering on what level
and it's also, but you already, consumption is already presupposed with production. I mean, Marx goes into this too in the sort of introduction to Grundrisse, and I think you're right though, Cam, that you can't, even if the connective is the first they discuss, and I think it is one of the easier ones to ease into these things. They will say that recording's already going on as production, as their connections are forming. So there's no, it's not even a chicken or egg thing. There's just no necessarily starting point, right? You brought up the rhizome earlier, but then the rhizome flourishes from the middle. So you kind of start in the middle. You're in medias res when we're talking about the syntheses.
Yeah. If there's no other comment, we can go back to the disjunctive synthesis.
Yeah, I'd definitely be down to talk about that. And just to add to the interesting, helpful graph that we have here, I would say that the illegitimate use for disjunctive synthesis for them is exclusive disjunction, right? That's not going to allow more of this to be exclusive, either this or that. And so, right in logic, we talk about the excluded middle, these other things. So there's a, for example, either man or woman, and
no boy girl
disjunction. Right, exactly. So inclusive disjunctions, for them, allows for a less, again, it kind of follows from their critique of the illegitimate use of the connective syntheses, where we get complete objects which through lack allow us to have global persons. There's a similar critique with the inclusive disjunction, where we aren't privileging first and foremost a sort of hardcore, hard set identity that would sort of pre-exist or be predetermined, whether it be biologically, like we were just mentioning, or molar category that might affix an identity to the desiring production, or whatever level we want to talk about.
Yeah, that's all interesting. I don't know what else I can really add to that, though.
Well, I mean, I think it starts on the second page or the second paragraph of this section where they say the action characteristic of edible recording is the introduction of an exclusive, restrictive, and negative use of the distinct synthesis. We are so molded by Oedipus that we find it hard to imagine another use, and even the three familial neuroses do not escape this use, although they suffer from no longer being capable of applying it. And then for their use, they say at the end, a disjunction that remains disjunct still affirms the disjoined terms. It affirms them throughout their entire distance without restricting one by the other or excluding the other from the one is perhaps the greatest paradox, either or, instead of either or.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
No, you go ahead.
I see that section, I think of, like I teach English, I think of my engagement with a student, and kind of, I am the teacher, they are the student, I am teaching, they are learning, and it's like, well, the actual interplay of an engagement is far more complex than that. There are moments where they have knowledge or they have process that I'm not familiar with. And then there's kind of a reversal of that teacher student relationship, or when you get them working in small groups and kind of the students are playing the role of teachers or learners within their own little groups, and if you kind of take an engagement like that, where I guess where a student is maybe challenging you on something or correcting you or whatever, you can really get into that. I am the teacher, you are the student, you are the teacher or the student, you are not the teacher and the student. Whereas if you kind of have you can be the teacher or you can be the student or you can be the assistant or you can be the whatever, and none of those are exclusive. You can be both of those or move through the process of both of those. There's permission to move through possibilities in a way that is otherwise precluded.
Yeah, I have kind of a slightly funnier example, I guess, that's kind of on the teaching thing. I can't say it's like 100% disjunctive, but it kind of goes in there. Like, I don't know, 4-ish years ago. I've gotten better at, I guess, tutoring and teaching my student peers, and eventually I hope to be a professor, so I do have to work on it even more. But early into like AP calculus, I had already gotten limits, and I was trying to help a friend get what limits are in like a calculus format, and I kept just kind of going back to the thing of, well, there's not a value there, but like you have to imagine that it is. And I guess to be in the disjunctive synthesis as a kind of, I guess, a tutor in that sense, I kept playing as myself. I kept playing as somebody who had already found the connections that understood limits for me, and I kept keeping in that framework, but I wasn't able to, I guess, accept myself as somebody who, or I wasn't able to like perform as myself as somebody who didn't understand what limits are, and who, I guess, to some degree thought that I was speaking crazy speak. What do you mean a point's not there, but I should be able to find it? Like, it just seems, I guess, to some degree, this synthesis, I guess the liberatory use that they can find of it is you kind of like, you step outside of the things that you've limited yourself to. I don't want to go too far. I just thought that was kind of a, I guess, a funny extension of your kind of teacher student example you had there, Britton.
Yeah, the example that comes to my mind is thinking about Nietzsche and how much Nietzsche is kind of a subterranean current throughout this work. Like some other philosophers, Spinoza being one, especially for this root of affirmation. But Nietzsche, held affirmation in high esteem, at least when it was qualified to a certain extent. But in any case, the thing I'm thinking about with Nietzsche is how, for him, especially with thinking about the ethical constraints of the eternal return, is how, if you exult in the idea of having to relive your life in the same way over and over, there's an affirmation of all the suffering that's kind of involved along the way to those moments of ecstasy and glory and blah blah blah. The main thing being for Nietzsche is that in a certain way, convalescence was a root of his philosophy, because from the height of health we get a new perspective on illness. From the depths of illness we can get a new perspective on health. And so the movement between the two, affirming them both as uh what's the word, as sort of accelerating them, not accelerating them, but augmenting them and increasing them through their distance itself. I think that's what is at play in the inclusive disjunction. So you have to affirm sort of the diametrical terminal point of sorrow or sadness in order to feel the higher heights of ecstasy. Because I think for Nietzsche, like, we deaden ourselves to pain and to these moments of suffering that the body may feel, or to sorrow that we may feel psychically, we also sort of deaden our capacity for joy and for feelings of overcoming and power. So I think that that's part of this inclusive disjunction, where we're not choosing just joy as though we can sort of live in a fantasy land or some sort of heaven. We have to sort of be able to affirm that contrary distance in order to even have one or the other. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah. I think I get it. You have to be willing to kind of, I mean, accept that just because you have invested in this guy's one way of being or becoming, or whatever phrase you want to put towards it, doesn't mean that continuing that way is necessarily going to be, I guess, good for you, if you want to do some moralistic terms. Or the limit, while it helps you kind of exist in reality, kind of traps you in some ways. One thing that kind of really helped me with this chapter was my recent engagement with actually going through the ethics for a class. Not a class that was talking about Spinoza, but one where I did my final project on Spinoza regardless.
Nice.
And I got a little bit into the chapter on the body. It was a metaphysics class, so I spent most of my time talking about the first chapter. But it does seem that Spinoza, while categorized a rationalist, with human psychology, does end up kind of being an empiricist in this weird way. Because especially with the quote, "the body does not yet," or "we do not know yet what a body can do," kind of implies, or at least in the Deleuzian understanding of Spinoza, kind of gives it this point where we're also gaining the experience of what we can do, but also investing and limiting ourselves at the same time. I don't know if that's the same kind of interpretation you give, because I know Spinoza and Deleuze are not necessarily the easiest thinkers or the most understood thinkers, so they do end up kind of having a million different interpretations.
Well, I think that if we take Foucault's preface, which I assume you guys read or maybe have read before,
it's been a year for me.
He has a few things. It's really good and it's nice and short and sweet. But one of the things he says is, Anti-Oedipus is one of the first books of ethics to be written in France in quite a while.
I agree with that.
I think that if we take ethics in the sense that Spinoza means it, in the way that Deleuze takes him to mean it, as sort of how you were explaining it, Cam, as engaging this question of what a body can do, right? Of an ethology to a certain extent, of a question of affects, instead of ethics in a kind of deontological sense of prescriptive rules, then I think that applies to this work, right? It's it's ethical in trying to unearth these intensive states that the inclusive disjunction indicates, rather than to try to like ward them off through the exclusive use, through this application of reason, which is really about too, because this gets back to what you brought up earlier, Cam. The other part of reason is this drive to mastery that Freud will talk about, and beyond the pleasure principle. I think there is a drive to mastery in reason, and this is why Freud could say that even in dreams, even in like men coming back from the First World War, having these anxiety dreams, these war dreams, even those fulfill a kind of wish fulfillment function for Freud, even if they may be terrifying. There's this will to master uh, the the appearance, the event of trauma, and build up enough anxiety to be prepared for it. Because for Freud, paradoxically, anxiety kind of prepares us for the unknown, and it prepares like a psychical shell that can keep us from being bombarded and wounded by the sort of trauma of the event. I think that to a certain extent, too, Deleuze and Guattari want to see that the flip side of this drive to mastery can well up in fascisms, right? And it's, this is why we have to interrogate the cop in our head, etc. Right? This is why we have to be aware of, when we get to it, the illegitimate use of the conjunctive synthesis, which will want to claim that that's me, I'm the subject who belongs to the master race, right? Like who identifies with the Aryan, movement uh, of this master race on the earth to dominate. They want to show that that's part and parcel of the illegitimate synthesis. So, the risks of each of the three syntheses and the kind of paralogisms they lead to in their illegitimate usage directly leads to Oedipus, directly leads to fascism, directly leads to these sort of terrible collective consequences and not just individual.
Yeah, after this specifically, I do really kind of want to mention that I don't know if you've seen it on Twitter or not, but the kind of the main reason I'm doing this reading group is kind of getting prepared for my senior thesis on trying to find an ethical project within Deleuze and Guattari. And I was discussing it with my advisor, and I think kind of the ethical question I settled on, like what is the thing true ethics surrounds itself by, is the question they pose in What is Philosophy? And that is, what might one do? Which I imagine originally when I first heard it on Philosophize This 2 years ago, ethics is the kind of the process of understanding determinism, which it's halfway there. But well, after being able to read through this text, I guess 1.5 times now, I'm at this point. One do is the understanding of one's own possibility. A true ethical project is liberation. It's not trying to find the good; it's liberating. And I think that is kind of because my introduction to philosophy kind of it started with ethics. That's kind of why I want to do it in ethics. In that I was trying to find what would actually find the good. Where is good, and what process can get me there? And it was kind of with Deleuze, with Nietzsche, with Spinoza, I've been kind of able to lose those questions, and in the process, I've been able to define what I'm actually looking for. The good is a problematic term because what I should actually be looking for, what actually solves all the problems that I've never been able to kind of, I guess, get past, is that the liberation, the ability to become, I guess, polyvocal is kind of the ethical project we should be looking for. We shouldn't be trying to find which things are right to do, but what things we can do. I mean, I have almost a whole year to kind of extrapolate on that, but the inclusive synthesis, I guess, after re-listening to the seminars that you and Coop did and going through this with both of these reading groups, it just kind of becomes much more important to me in that regard. I don't know if either of you want to respond to that or want to move on somewhere else, though.
There's a tweet by Sean, the YouTuber, that actually has framed a lot of my thinking recently. I think the language of it's really useful. I can't even remember what it was about specifically, but basically about there's a lot of people who have internalized things as a series of rules versus as a set of values. So that, if we're talking in any space, in LGBTQ liberation, in racial justice, things like that, that there's this kind of swing to, okay, well, here's the words you're allowed to say, and here's the words you can say if you have this particular background, and if you don't have this background, if you kind of half have this background, if you're like in this world, but maybe you have this mixed identity, okay, you identify as bisexual, but you've only had relationships with people of the opposite gender, so to speak, or whatever, then here's the way you're allowed to talk about this, versus actually saying, okay, what are our values, what are our intentions, to sort of borrow from that difference repetition, leaving things open as a problem, as opposed to closing them off as a question that has a direct answer or an implied answer. And how do we actually engage with things, with these ethical challenges of how we act, what we do, how we engage, who we are, without starting with an image and trying to reach a perfect image of, this is exactly what it all has to look like. This is exactly how it all has to be. What does it look like if we engage, with kind of this set of, I guess, principles or values or intentions, versus trying to make a perfect image of things, and actually leave things open as a space for engagement. And that means that those rules are not going to work. We're not going to be able to have that sort of exclusive disjunctions where things are one way or another, this way or another way. We actually have to live with the trouble. I think that's a Haraway thing. It's actually exist at the point of conflict, at the point of complexity, without leaning into the temptation of trying to simplify that complexity into a set of simple answers, because that's going to lead us to the same type of challenge. And that's sort of what comes to mind with you talking about your project.
Yeah, I do think that I guess that comment's pretty helpful. Is there anything you want to say, Taylor? Or if not, I want to go towards the end of the conjunctive synthesis again.
Yeah, I mean, just with the disjunctive, gosh, I guess there's a lot that could be said, but I guess that one quote,
You trying to
where
find
they
it?
say schizoanalysis. Yeah, I'll just read it. It's real quick. Schizoanalysis proposes to reach those regions of the orphan unconscious, indeed beyond all law, where the problem of Oedipus can no longer even be raised. I just thought that was kind of an interesting quote. I mean, I know I'm taking it out of context, but I think it maybe stands alone. And I sort of like to sometimes find those standout banger sentences, even though there's a lot of them, but that can stand alone. But we can definitely go to the conjunctive.
Yeah. I just kind of want to go to the second half of that chapter. Right now, I'm towards the end. For those in different editions, this will be the bottom half of the second to last paragraph of the conjunctive synthesis. Hopefully that helps. The one that the paragraph ends with, hence the goal of psychoanalysis to analyze the specific nature of the libidinal investments in the economic and political spheres. But I can also read this out. Also, for future reference for any other reading groups, do not feel bad for reading like half a paragraph, because I'm about to read half a paragraph. We define the reactionary unconscious investments as the investment that conforms to the interest of the dominant class, but operates on its own account, according to the terms of desire, through the segregative use of the conjunctive synthesis, from which Oedipus is derived. I am of the superior race. The revolutionary unconscious investment is such that desire, still in its own mode, cuts across the interests of the dominated, exploited classes and causes flows to move that are capable of breaking apart both the segregations and their Oedipal applications. Flows incapable of hallucinating history, of reanimating the races in delirium, of setting continents ablaze. And then it goes on further than that, but it really kind of brings out for me, it feels like this is the first thoughts that come into becoming minor in, I think Kafka is the book, or Kafka and minor literature, as well as becoming minor part of, I forget if that's in 1,000 Plateaus or not.
Yep.
Well, yeah, they continue it in 1,000 Plateaus.
Micropolitics, I think, is what it's in, if I'm thinking of the right plateau.
Should be there. You should see it in perhaps in the 10th plateau and becoming, perhaps in the apparatus of capture. But yeah, it's definitely mentioned in definitely micropolitics and segmentarity.
Yeah, I just thought that this kind of ending was like a really good connection from what we were discussing at the final parts of the disjunctive synthesis, in that, but what becoming minor feels like to me is that in an, I guess, a schizoanalytic ethical project, the goal isn't to find this way to, I guess, strengthen a proper ego as it might be in Anna Freud or Melanie Klein, but to kind of, as we were talking about earlier, find the own particular way that allows for, I guess, a productive functioning that is kind of positive in some way. I don't know if we can't, it's really hard to define what positive means in post-structuralism. But something that I guess benefits everybody, that doesn't see itself on top, that is able to see kind of, to some degree, to see itself as distinct and different, even if it has these kind of similarities with others. Is there anything either of you want to talk about with that kind of quote? It is a little bit of a long one.
No, I think it sums it up nicely, though. The difference between the reactionary and the revolutionary investments. You know, I think it's important to question. This is why, like, I forget, this was a few weeks ago. Maybe you saw it or even replied to it, Cam, but
Possibly.
you know, whenever I see people talk about like the downfall of Western civilization or its degeneration, I start to get those vibes where that's a kind of fascist reactionary type of investment where you're thinking that the West is sort of like the height of civilization and now it's crumbling all around you, and oh no, my master race is dying out or some shit. It just sounds like another way of saying the 14 words.
Yeah.
And this is you see this in all the blue check like civilization,
Yeah.
Western Civ type accounts with like a you know, an ancient Greek sculpture as their PFP,
Except for that
kind of
one.
well, maybe there's always an exception that proves the rule, though, right? That
There's this one guy
all
that does
these
these
accounts. It's red flags, man. Red flags.
No, there's this one guy that feels like he should be a red flag, where he always starts his, like, it's always kind of like this weird thing where he has the ancient Greek statue thing, and it's like cultural something, and it sounds like he should be some like reactionary fascist, but every single thread is like a thoughtful discussion of history or architecture or something, and you're like, man, pick another profile picture, just pick a different username, like you're too good for this like stereotype to be applied to you. But something I wanted to mention with kind of, you see it a lot with Twitter discourse, in particular. I mean, I kind of, just out of like what I'm willing to tolerate, do end up around people who are willing to, I guess, take up to some degree a project of becoming minor, in that they choose kind of a little bit more societally, or I don't want to say that, but they choose more, I guess, gender identities that kind of are more particular than the general ones we see, in a lot of cases. But what I find as a problem in a lot of discourse is that a lot of people sound like they want to be in the middle of oppression rather than destroy oppression at all. I don't know how much that's experienced for the the rest of y'all, but a lot of what we talked about in this quote in the last reading group, or at least I talked about, was kind of the LGB without the T type stuff, where these groups that really are at the second, or not groups as a whole. I don't think gay people as a whole believe this. Maybe like 5% or less of them, once gay people became kind of part of the norm of like American or English society, they started kind of turning on the direct outside, and not realizing that once reactionaries can get rid of that, the auxiliary, I guess, around the border wall of normal of it's really hard to do this without a graph, but once the reactionary sources at the center are able to get rid of what they deem the least normal right now, the next thing they're going to turn on to a new least normal, and that will be gay people or bi people or eventually different races. And then after that, people who aren't considered white enough, and it just keeps getting further and further closer to this kind of like paranoid center that always has to be justified by war, to some degree, or exclusion, or however you want to say it. And I think becoming minor is an important, I guess, fix to that kind of type of thinking, because you start caring more about what is on the edges, what identities are unrepresented, as this kind of Derrida's political project to some degree, with, I forget, the metaphysics of presence kind of deal. But you start caring about like I was saying, you start caring about the identities that don't have the same protections or don't express themselves in the way that the majority of people do, not normal people, because we want to get rid of that term. And that's kind of what the switch is for how I interpret what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do here. Rather than trying to become part of the center, you're trying to allow for different possibilities of expression or existence, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's just how the majoritarian standard works, right? It what they say in, I think, in the faciality plateau is that, the majoritarian kind of radiates out these waves of sameness, and the further off you are from that standard, the more suspect, and the more you look like an enemy or an other from that standard. And that's why they say that there is no becoming man, because man, especially in English and French, are kind of the majoritarian standard, the sort of pre-given. And
yeah, in French, it's a group of 99 women and one man becomes il instead of elle.
Yeah, right. So it's something similar, exactly. And I will say, before we continue, the very last sentence of this section, I like that they bring in the literary machine, right? Because they say, for reading a text is never a scholarly exercise in search of what is signified, still less a highly textual exercise in search of a signifier. Rather, is a productive use of the literary machine, a montage of design machines, a schizoid exercise that extracts from the text its revolutionary force. I just think that's important to remember. This is why they kind of want the literary machine to be functioning in step with the revolutionary machine, with the analytic machine, and have all these kind of cogs working together rather than privileging one or the other. And why it's important too, I think, in Anti-Oedipus, which is a very difficult book to read, not to try to always, even if we may need to do it sometimes to just get a foothold, not to always worry about what any one concept or sentence or paragraph even may signify, but sort of like, what is the force of the argument that's beyond the expression itself, but like, what is its potential use? Yeah,
I think that's a good close. And Breton, do you want to add anything to this chapter? If not, we can try to do the 4 last chapters that we didn't get to in the other reading group.
No, that's really it. I think that this is something that I really love, this conversation about kind of the two poles, and I think that we kind of squeezed all the juice out of it. There's a conversation I'd love to have about becoming woman at some point, but I think it's going to be better for us to move to the rest of this, and I'll raise that if that comes up again later.
Yeah, totally. Anything on chapter 6? Kind of, this is, I mean, I've read this twice now, but it is kind of new territory for the reading group, especially as a second section. So I'm going to be a little, I guess, weaker on this one than the others beforehand.
Now you're saying chapter, you mean section. So you're talking about social repression and psychic repression?
6, I was talking about a recapitulation of the 3 syntheses first.
Okay, recapitulation, got it.
Yeah. And if there's nothing there, then we can move on to the next one, but go ahead.
I just think it's good to remember the illegitimate uses that they're targeting, and that they see at work in psychoanalysis, they see it work in everyday life, they see it work in sort of normal neurotic ways of representing the status quo and justifying it versus the legitimate uses, right? The non-restrictive connective, the inclusive disjunctive, the the nomadic and polyvocal use of the conjunctive versus the segregative and biunivocal use. I think it's just good to remember that all of these are kind of part and parcel. And they say the 3 errors concerning desire are called lack, law, and signifier. It is one and the same error and idealism that forms a pious conception of the unconscious. So I think that that's their target. And this gets back to the title of the chapter, right? About the Holy Family, which is obviously also
a Marx book.
A reference to Marx and Engels, yeah.
Wasn't there someone else who wrote a book on the Holy Family? I think I remember Coop bringing it up in one of your discussions.
Well, if I remember,
or it might have been the Holy. I might have been thinking about Anti-Oedipus as
Anti-During.
Yeah, Anti-During and the Antichrist. Yeah, sorry, I got that mixed up.
No, it's all good. There's Anti-Cato from, I think, Caesar. There's Anti-During, which is Engels. There's Antichrist, which is Nietzsche. I think perhaps all of these, at least the Engels and Nietzsche, are resonating. But it can go even. There may even be something further back than Anti-Cato. But that might not be as relevant. But there is there's a tradition of a kind of anti-discourse.
Yeah, there's the in the Marxism introduction, he says something, and then I read the whole book specifically looking for where they said this, and I think it seems to be a Marxism special observation, which is, he kind of says, the Anti-Oedipus is like the Antichrist. It's this figure who's not bound to the logic of not bound to the logic of Oedipus. And it's kind of this figure that we're trying to discover within ourselves.
And they have that reference to Klosowski's Le Baphomet, right, where God is the master of the exclusive disjunction, whereas the Antichrist is like the prince of modifications and these inclusive molecular intensive states. So they could even be thinking of Klosowski's conceptual persona from that novel. It wouldn't surprise me if they kind of had all of this in mind when they crystallized around the title.
That's really helpful.
Before we move on to 7, there's something that I must have highlighted a while ago that if we don't get anything out of it, it is an amazing quote here. The unconscious has its horrors, but they are not anthropomorphic. It is not the slumber of reason that engenders monsters, but vigilant and insomniac rationality. I do absolutely love that quote. It does kind of it feels a little what's his name? Who has Cthulhu?
Yeah, Lovecraft.
Yeah, Lovecraft. It feels a little Lovecraftian.
That's really funny because in my project I'm bringing the Cthulhu mythos into it.
Yeah.
And I don't think I attach it to that particular quote, but it's definitely that's a definite I think link that I think is really straightforward to draw. That's good.
Yeah, I do think this particular quote kind of also goes back to like how we've been discussing reason as this production of desire. And I was trying to I use my Substack as kind of like a late night thoughts kind of thing. I know that's a probably semi improper way of putting it, or semi improper way of using Substack as like a academic form. But kind of when I was trying to like put down how I thought desire was this product of reason, or opposite way, reason is a product of desire. And one thing I did come to, and I was reading The Machine Unconscious, and I think Guattari kind of talks about this as well. I read this part of The Machine Unconscious after I'd written this, but the way that I guess rationality forms, which is also within these social, political, and historical fields, it creates these new languages that are spoken between, or not spoken between each other, but spoken separately among people who invest differently, whether that's I guess more fascistic or reactionary investments are going to end up in a different type of reason, a different type of I guess logic than I guess the liberal modes of thinking or the socialist modes of thinking. And that's kind of why it is going to be so hard to bridge those gaps between those, because the way that one processes reality is going to be just kind of fundamentally different on those levels. Sorry, I'm trying to type something.
I love this section too, where it's kind of like, it's only when you kind of this bit here, transgression, guilt, castration, are these the determinations of the unconscious, or is it the way a priest sees things? I think that's just such a really nice way of just saying, it's like the kind of, these problems don't precede the behavior. It's not like we're behaving terribly. It's kind of like, it's this rationality that then locates everything in a place, that then kind of explains, okay, well, because now you have to think about what you're doing, and everything has to be kind of given a place. The place where your activity lives is it's in the naughty corner. Actually, that's kind of messed up, dude. What are you doing? And it's kind of like that's the criticism, I guess, that feels like it's being made there.
Yeah, it does seem a lot like that. I got the mention of priest always reminds me about the I got a used copy of the Walter Kaufman translation of the Genealogy of Morals. When I was reading through that, there was like this huge pencil mark at like the beginning that just said, why does he talk about priests so much in essay 3? And I just couldn't get it out of my mind. I had to, I can't completely give you a full lecture on why he discusses priests so much, but that's kind of what I went into the book with this guy that was just so confused that why Nietzsche just keeps going back to this priest talk in the chapter. I believe it's on the aesthetic ideal, if I remember correctly. This goes back to it once again, and you also find it here. You find it to some degree in Foucault's talk on psychoanalysis, and I haven't read The Birth of the Clinic yet, but it's definitely in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And it's talked about here multiple times. Is there anything on the subsection 6 that we want to discuss anymore, or if not, we can go ahead to what is it? Paranoia or social repression and psychic repression.
Yeah, we can go ahead.
Okay.
I need to head out in a moment. I just wanted to say that one of the things that first of all, thank you so much for the session. It's been really good. I want to say one of the things that I picked up on that really made it so much easier to read Deleuze is that he has this habit, and I think it's, we're not meant to split them, but I think it's something we see a lot in Deleuze's even solo writings, is just loves to have like a list of 3 or 4 things and then like coordinate that in the next couple of sentences. So just in here, in the paragraph starting while the critical study of Freudian ideology, where we've just got in a row, exploratory, pioneering, revolutionary, classic cultural, sorry, I've lost it. But the 3 exploratory, pioneering, revolutionary, and then they do it up again into like classic culture and the sort of racket, and then Christopher Columbus, Goethe, Shakespeare, Sophocles, Al Capone. It seems like it's kind of follows that pattern of 3. I've only underlined 2 here for some reason, but it seems like there's all the time we have these patterns of the first, second, third relates to the third, first, second, third, next line relates to the first, second, third, final line. That's all I was going to add to that, and I made a bit of a dog's breakfast of it. I'm sorry, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining today, Brenton. I hope to see you in the later reading groups.
Hope to be there.
Well, I don't want to take up too much longer of your time, Taylor, but I do hope to get through the last 3 here. So if you will stick with me for a minute, I hope we can do it together.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining as well. It is very, I'm kind of honored that you're in this reading group, honestly.
Oh man, yeah, dude. I mean, this is stuff I really enjoy. So no worries at all. I will start off just by pointing out, because I know we won't have time to really dig into all these very very deeply, but I think it's interesting that they add that if there was a paralogism for each of the syntheses, right? If there was due to the illegitimate usage of them, they add this 4th paralogism, which they call the paralogism of displacement. And I briefly mentioned it earlier, but that for them, right, the prohibition, you can't infer the desire from the prohibition, right? The prohibition it's in its own interest to discredit, disparage, and distort desire, right? And so, they say the law tells us you will not marry your mother and you will not kill your father. We docile subjects say to ourselves, so that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So of course I wanted to kill my father. Thank you for making me realize this. But yeah, they say this is the 4th paralogism that kind of, I think, would supposedly just be latched on to all 3 of the syntheses in their illegitimate usage, right? What we get out of this is Oedipus, because Oedipus will be the distorted image of desire formulated by the prohibition.
Yeah, I think we got to that last time, and one of our, I guess, members had a problem with I think it was talking about the same subject in the earlier chapters, in that I think it uses the wrong term, or they thought it used the wrong term, and I was trying to explain. I think redirecting desire is also a good way to do it instead of distorting necessarily. Not to say that the terms you're using are necessarily wrong. Just kind of, I forget if it's this chapter or the latter 2, but they kind of talk about desire is going to destroy any social, if without repression, it's going to destroy all these social institutions, because it's always going to find new functions. If desire is just let go to free flow, all these institutions are not going to be able to, I guess, crystallize for a very long period of time. They're gonna rise up and then fall, rise up and fall, etc.
Yeah, I mean, they say something similar in ATP about allowing desire to leak is bad for the status quo. I don't think that necessarily means that we would just have chaos, right? That we would, but we would
Yeah,
have
no.
the creative capacity to form different institutions that aren't, as Guattari would say, that aren't immortalizing themselves, that have a little bit of the death drive.
It'd be
And,
nomadic.
yeah, nomadic, polyvocal, etc. All the other legitimate uses of the syntheses. The only thing I would say about the language, it's because they talk about desire, that the distortion of desire created by the prohibition and the displacement caused by us inferring desire from the prohibition.
So the distortion
that
is
for
the
them,
I
it's
wanted that.
the distortion, yes, and they talk about it as an image, right? So they say that Oedipus is a sham image of desire. Such is the nature of Oedipus, the sham image. Repression does not operate through Oedipus, nor is it directed at Oedipus. Yada yada yada. So I think that their language of images is why they say use that language of distortion and not just redirection.
Yeah. But it is kind of interesting to view desire as kind of this liberatory force, because it is Schopenhauer is the exact opposite view, which I haven't read enough Schopenhauer yet, but from what I understand,
his understanding
he's
of desire is totally different though. But yeah, go ahead.
From what I've heard, it's mostly through, I guess, a meme, is that Schopenhauer is like, oh my God, I will so much stuff. Woe is me. I wish I could stop.
Mm-hmm. That's basically it, because for him, desire, his understanding of desire is not Kantian in the sense of the faculty of desire so much as Buddhistic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's getting this idea that desire is suffering and that existence is necessarily entangled up in desire. And so the way to get out of suffering in the wheel of existence is to will my non-existence and to sort of cancel out desire in the world. And that's how one kind of transcends this mortal coil. And it's interesting how much Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer, because later he sees in this type of pessimism, if you want, for lack of a better word, this a kind of exhaustion with life. Instead of exulting in life, there's an exhaustion of life. And he sees in that a kind of nihilism, pure and simple. And so this is what causes him to break away from Schopenhauer.
He's not life affirming enough,
because it's not, because for Schopenhauer, the will to life is this movement of desire to perpetuate itself. And so his solution is to kind of seek a type of Buddhist way of wanting to reconcile with universal harmony by desire canceling itself out. And I think for Nietzsche, this is why will to power, which is not the will to have power, but the will to
pouvoir is a better
others.
translation.
Well, that's why the French translated as volonté de puissance, right? It's about enhancing our capacity for acting, which is what we've been talking about with Spinoza, with ethics, with your take on it. And this is where I think Deleuze sees Nietzsche and Spinoza as kind of
a tradition,
closely allied.
Yeah, I do particularly like, a lot of people I know criticize the French thinkers for their interpretation for Nietzsche, but English and French, I feel like the connotations of the word power, I guess, to get into, translation talk to a little bit, kind of do lend towards those different abilities, where the English, I guess, under the connotation of power lends itself towards, I guess, how the reactionaries in Germany kind of understood Nietzsche's will to power.
Right.
Whereas the French were like, oh, well, power in French means the ability to do. Therefore, Nietzsche wants me to be able to do as much as possible. That's what a life affirming means. It means not limiting myself to anything.
And
that's a reduction, but still.
If fascists or reactionaries had translated Nietzsche, they might have translated it as pouvoir, like you suggested, which is where we get our word power from. Sadly, we don't have, well, we do have puissance. So I mean, we could, if
Can
we wanted
ability.
to, translate it as will to puissance, except that in English, puissance is both kind of archaic and also still too much tied up with power, not to really be distinct. So I think it wouldn't necessarily solve the problem. And you know, it's it's just one of those things, but that I think that the French being able to utilize a different word gives it, lends it to not having misunderstandings.
Yeah. I guess to kind of return to the text, I kind of want to talk about what's on the page 119, so one page after what we were discussing about 5 minutes ago. I guess two quotes here. Psychic repression distinguishes itself from social repression by the unconscious nature of the operation and by its results. And then a little further down, strictly speaking, psychic repression is a means in the service of social repression. What it bears on is also the object of social repression, desiring production.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that gets at the heart of the chapter, obviously, because it has the two terms that the chapter's named after, or the subsection's named after. But kind of this, I guess you kind of have to make this distinction. It's like, at what point, if we're going to have these two terms, why isn't one the other? Why isn't social repression psychic repression, or vice versa, mattering on what we privilege? And I guess first off, we have to answer, why have two of them? Is one part of the other? I guess is like a first question for myself, because I haven't been able to revisit this with a group quite yet. Do you have anything to say on these couple of quotes here, middle paragraph 119?
Yeah, you know, I mean, the French have two words again, where we only have the one.
For repression, yeah, I
As the
remember.
translators, yeah, they have refoulement for when they talk about psychic repression, and this is generally what Freud is going to be discussing. But for you know, and then they have the word repression for social repression,
Yeah.
whereas we just have the one we use. And so I think that the way that I try to think about it is specifically through the family, which, you know, later on in this chapter, maybe a page or so, or even another paragraph, they say the family is the delegated agent of psychic repression.
Yeah, that's the next
You know, I
paragraph.
think for Deleuze and Guattari, um, you know, psychic repression is the way in which social repression is kind of justified, and it bolsters it, right? This is why this is one of their critiques of Freud, and sort of shoring up normal neurotic as the path of adjusting one to the dominant order of things, or to allow one to go back to work and be a good worker for the capitalist society, right? And so for them, you know, what do they say? It is in one and the same movement that the repressive social production is replaced by the repressing family, and that the latter offers a displaced image of desire production that represents the repressed as incestuous familial drives, right? So I think that for Freud to sort of um, social factors in the development of consciousness back to the family, he's this sort of intermingling and inter augmentation of social and psychic repression, right? Like that, there's a way in which you, by cutting out the social factors and sort of zooming in too much on the family, on just the household, you're kind of restricting your gaze, you're restricting your observatory data, even, of desiring production. You're simplifying things, but you're also, in that way, distorting them.
It also seems to me that if I guess the second wave of psychoanalysis, or maybe third wave, I don't know, I need to brush up on my history for that, but by the time you get to, I guess, late Freud, and then the immediate people that come after him, the strengthening the ego, as we've discussed, is kind of the main project of psychoanalysis. But if the ego is already created out of these social, historical, and political, I guess, attitudes or formations that exist, I guess, concurrently to the subject, then strengthening the ego is also at the same time strengthening I guess, to the control that these social institutions have over the individual to some degree. I mean that
Right. It's
might
just
be,
adjusting them.
yeah. I mean, strengthening the ego is basically, to some degree, strengthening the justifications the subject is going to have for the status quo as it is in society. I guess to kind of get psychopolitical.
No, I think that's right. Strengthening the ego is allowing them to perpetuate the norms and demands and status quo of the society in which they live, i.e., capitalism, most generally, if we're talking about this historical period. And this is why one of Lacan's early targets and is this kind of vitriol for the type of psychoanalysis he saw going on, specifically in Great Britain, but no doubt in America too, spearheaded by Anna Freud and others, as you said, which is about strengthening the ego. Lacan very often, at least in the early seminars, is targeting them most explicitly, and showing how strengthening the ego is not, just like Oedipus. It's not a catch-all cure for tackling the problems and struggles that the individuals face.
Yeah. Just to not take up too much of your time, I guess we can move on to the eighth section, because I do think it is important when discussing I guess the schizophrenic and how Deleuze and Guattari are viewing them.
So this is the process, correct?
Neuroses and psychosis, and then the process is the schizophrenic outside of neuroses or psychosis.
Got it. I
Yeah.
must have skipped past this. Okay, but go on. Yeah, if you had anything here, I can try to respond.
What I get out of this was kind of in, I guess, the Oedipalization project, either of society as a whole or in the psychoanalytic room. If the schizophrenic doesn't just like isn't able to escape, or we aren't able to escape, we kind of either fall into, I guess, one or the other. I guess specifically talking about kind of, I guess, the schizophrenic is the semi-medical term that Deleuze and Guattari kind of use for it. I understand neuroses as what's the film's name? Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Love the Bomb. You learn to love Oedipus, and you come into the psychoanalytic room, and you're excited to get Oedipus again. Or psychoses, on the other end, you just turn every desire off so that you can avoid Oedipus at all cost. Yeah, I think that's at the top of 124.
24.
He is not suffering from a divided self or a shattered Oedipus, but on the contrary, from having been brought back to everything he had left. A drop in intensity to the body without organs equals zero. Autism. The schizo has no other means of reacting to this blocking of all of his investments of reality. The barriers placed before him by the Oedipal system of the social and psychic repression, etc. Basically, just you lose all grip on reality because reality is forcing you to, I guess, turn in this direction that you don't wish to. Trying to figure out what else. Is there anything you want to respond to so far?
Yeah, I mean, Freud will name various different neuroses. The most prominent of which are, the hysterical formation, obsessive compulsive. He'll even talk about anxiety neuroses as a general term that blankets them. I'm sure there's a couple of others that I'm just blanking out on, because I usually don't even try to think of them as just a blanket to hold them all in. But I think it's helpful to remember, I suppose, that the neuroses is a plural, right? And sometimes we just talk about neurotic, which I tend to do, but it's good to remember that the hysteric and the obsessive kind of fall into that as well, with their own distinct type of demands and struggles. I mean, Lacan will take this in his own way and in interesting ways that, I think that for Deleuze and Guattari, I think they're using the term fairly generally, and I think he summed it up.
Yeah, just kind of a general sum up instead of trying to discuss each one individually, which would probably mean that they had to write like 6 more chapters, and it's probably easier just to group every neuroses into one.
Yeah.
I don't know what else we can really get out of this chapter. I mean, there's a lot here, but it does seem to kind of relate back to either repression or the escape from reality.
I mean,
here's at 126. Everything can be converted into neuroses or warped out of shape into psychosis. It is therefore not in this fashion that the question must be posed.
Yeah.
But if there's nothing else here, we can go ahead and finish off with the process. This was a very interesting chapter for me, because it kind of does. It really does only make sense a lot easier once you actually are able to internalize the 3 sentences and kind of understand what they mean, rather than just reading the words instead of what they actually mean. Because you finally get, I guess schizophrenia in their term would be the proper function of these 3 sentences put towards, I guess, interacting in the real world.
And as long as we remember, schizophrenia as a process is not to be confused with
the medical
diagnostic term. Yeah, I mean, I think that caused them a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of grief. That I can see that as kind of Guattari's choice, but I can also see this as Deleuze's. In logic of sense, he's writing about Artaud, and he's about Artaud's schizophrenia as a part and parcel of his creative process, as part and parcel that allowed him to sort of go beyond the strictures of everyday ordinary usage of language and create a language within language, so to speak. Right. So I do think they're trying to take the nosographical diagnostic terminology of psychoanalysis and try to force a term like schizophrenia to stand for this creative process. And they'll do something similar with paranoia, as we'll see later in the later chapters, right? The schizophrenic and paranoid poles of the socius. They'll try to really turn these terminologies into concepts. Now, how much they succeed, I think that we could tell by A Thousand Plateaus. They've kind of
given up project,
but it's at least admirable to a certain extent.
Yeah. I think then the next thing I really want to discuss, and one thing I kind of I wanted to understand if it was important for my, I guess, the ethical social thesis or senior thesis that I'm working on, is this connection between breakthrough and breakdown. I know they kind of talk about it without saying it in How to Become a Body Without Organs, kind of how to, I guess, create new ways of desiring without doing what Nick Land seems that you want to do and becoming nothing. Where they write a whole chapter, it's like, please don't do that. And then Nick Land's like, oh, well, I'm going to ignore that, obviously. And now I'm a reactionary person who tweets all day. Is that, I think that's what he does, right? I don't want to talk about Nick Land too much. So. That's fair. No, that's it's the proper thing to do, honestly, at this point. But I guess I'll read it. Bottom of 131. Madness Madness need not be all breakdown. It may also be breakthrough. The person going through ego loss or transcendental experiences may or may not become, in different ways, confused. Then he might legitimately be regarded as mad. But to be mad is not necessarily to be ill, notwithstanding that in our culture, the two categories have become confused. From the alienated starting point of our pseudo sanity, everything is equivocal. I guess I don't know if it's if they bring it up in chapter 1. If not, it's at least brought here that the breakdown can become breakthrough to some degree. And I was trying to get, I guess, a Baudrillardian kind of view out of that. I don't know if, but or at least what I get out of Baudrillard, and kind of like a glitch to the system in a way. I don't know how much, if I'm like if I'm manifesting that in the Baudrillard, if that's something in him, because I haven't actually, I need to pick up Baudrillard again. It's been like a year. But kind of, what I kind of wanted to bring out of it into my project with these two cons, or this like sentence, breakdown being breakthrough, or the possibility of breakdown becoming breakthrough, is kind of what I'm reading through with Guattari and the machine conscious is like, how could these non-language symbols or other ways that inform our desiring that aren't just the language that exists wholly within the social historical framework, and political framework, how can those signs that don't exist, I guess, purely within rational language be able to kind of put a glitch in the system for our symbolic consciousness or symbolic unconsciousness, whatever you want to call it, kind of be able to what's the part they kind of talk about it with the Oedipal triangle, in that there's the 3+1, but that the triangle is always kind of open in a way. There's always a way to get outside of it. I don't want to bring way too many things together and just kind of make an incoherent sentence here, but kind of how can we, in your view, since you've been able to, I guess, think about it for a little bit longer, if you have focused on this section, bring about these, I guess, something that external that causes a breakdown lead to a breakthrough, the ability to get past our symbolic understanding of reality, and become, I guess, more free flowing, less repressed. I don't know the exact correct term.
I mean, so it's interesting just scanning through the text. I saw that they have a line where let no one suppose that we meet true madness any more than we are truly sane. The madness that we encounter in patience is a gross travesty, a mockery, a grotesque caricature of what the natural healing of that estranged integration we call sanity might be. True sanity entails in one way or another the dissolution of the normal ego. And they're quoting Artie Lang here.
Yeah.
What's interesting is this is why, for them, I think that what could potentially entail botching the body without origin at 1,000 plateaus could also lead to the breakthrough, right? The breakdown that obviously dissolution of the ego, whether it be in psychedelic drugs or transcendental meditation or in some kind of midlife crisis or maybe in a moment of ecstasy, that can go bad. And I think that that's the risk one takes in order to engage in this thing they're talking about as schizophrenia as a process, right? This nomadic and polyvocal usage of language, this notion that Deleuze is very clear about this, especially after Anti-Oedipus, when he's talking about how, especially with young people, the use of drugs, for example, to sort of free one's mind can be used productively, of course, but it can also
microdosing
harbor, but it can also harbor dangers that could lead to, obviously addiction is one of them, but other sorts of calamities, even up to, death and other types of bad outcomes. So, I think this is why Deleuze is very guarded about, and this is why I think 1,000 Plateaus has a lot more cautionary language about things. and why they have something like
It's about like
a
slowly
little urban
deteriorating.
water. Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, you brought up Nick Land, but I think that's why he prefers Anti-Oedipus with its emphasis on absolute deterritorialization versus their cautions regarding deterritorializing too quickly in 1,000 plateaus.
Yeah.
There's more of a discussion of relative deterritorialization, etc. Because it's not just about speed, and it's not just about it's not as though drugs in and of themselves can be a shortcut to some of the dismantling and the curatage of the unconscious that they talk about as one of the destructive tasks of schizoanalysis, right? It's if it were that easy, and I think one can think of like Timothy Leary, tune in, turn on, drop out kind of thing, right? Like one can imagine how liberating socially and collectively the 60s may have been, right, in terms of this use of psychedelics. And we know that psychedelics have personal uses that can help overcome other addictions like alcoholism and help to reform pathways in our neural uh, channels and these other things. So they can even have individual usages that are not just about this kind of schizophrenia as a process thing, but Deleuze is very, very clear that he's seen where young people as students of his, just kind of practice as a crutch, and that I think for Deleuze and Guattari, they want schizoanalysis and pharmacology, experimentally or not, to be able to work together. It's not some sort of just natural healing stuff, but an over reliance on that aspect could be mere pleasure seeking. And I think that for Deleuze, pleasure and enjoyment or desire are not necessarily pleasure and desire are not necessarily in lockstep. That in certain ways, pleasure can even thwart desire or lead it down these paths that aren't kind of truly liberatory, if we're sticking with the ethical language, right? So anyway, I myself, I do love psychedelics, but it's something I only do every 3 to 5 years. I think that
Sounds safe.
you do need to have enough downtime to sort of get the effects,
Yeah.
the
You
best
don't want
out
to do
of
a
it.
bad
And I'm
trip.
not telling it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not telling anyone how to interact with drugs. I'm merely kind of recapitulating some of their talk. But in any case, I think for them, schizophrenia as a process doesn't necessarily require drugs to be carried out and to be followed. It's
Yeah.
merely though that their example of dissolving the ego, I think, most readily and most safely can be done with the aid of psychedelics. In my
Yeah, it might help in some ways. But I feel like I'm almost kind of insulted by the notion that drugs are kind of the only way to deterritorialize to the extent that schizoanalysis would want. Because I think
yeah
in being able to analyze, doing a self-analysis, the reason I got into, I guess, philosophy to some degree, and particularly why I latched onto Oedipus, or why I invested in, or not Oedipus, why I invested in Deleuze and Guattari once I found out who they were, and I was like, wow, these are the guys these are my guys here, was because kind of like, I don't know, 5.5, 6 years ago, kind of I did have this breakdown to breakthrough process. I got the good end of it. And it I guess it was this kind of turn from, I guess, reactionary investments towards revolutionary investments, because the way I desire had these conflicts or whatever that led to these, I guess, I don't know how to explain it perfectly in Deleuze Guattari terms, but I guess the breakthrough I was going there, the conflicts that opened up the possibility of something having to give, meant that eventually I guess I got down the perfect path to where I was able to just completely turn the way I desire around towards something that ultimately it does make me happier being a progressive to some degree, rather than some like resentful conservative like I was in, I guess, the middle part of high school. But I mean, I the reason I kind of got into philosophy and specifically stuck with Deleuze was I never understood how it happened. Like I just went through it, but I was never able to understand on the end. It was like, okay, well, I've completely changed my view of the world in the last 2 years. Not 2 years now, but like I'm thinking of myself in like 2019. Um, how the hell did I get here? Like I'm glad I'm here, but I can't give you the proper way of explaining how that happened. But I also want other people to experience the possibility of understanding that they don't have to think in the same way that they used to. And I kind of do agree with the slow process thing, because it took months to maybe 2 years for that experience to go through and fully complete, where these reactionary investments slowly dissipate, and they become, I guess, better revolutionary investments. I don't want to get too personal here, but it is kind of love, politics, all these other things can be just as deterritorializing as, I guess, drugs can be, because all of these kind of have these I guess different effects, where drugs might be the loosening of the ego, love and politics might be desire running up against itself, and literally like I guess two pipes like running into each other. The water can't flow either way, so something has to give, kind of deal. And I think that will probably end up making it into my paper, which I hope to actually finish instead of just claiming it as my big project and then letting everything down. But are there any thoughts on that, or final thoughts? We have been here for almost 3 hours now, so.
True. I do think at the very end of in the very last paragraph of the chapter, they say schizophrenia is at once the wall, the breaking through the wall, and the failures of this breakthrough. Quote, how does one go through this wall? For it is useless to hit it hard. It has to be undermined and penetrated with a file, slowly and with patience, as I see it. And then they talk about what is at stake. It's not merely art or literature. Either the artistic machine, the analytic machine, and the revolutionary machine will remain in extrinsic relationships that make them function in the deadening framework of the system of social and psychic repression, or they will become parts and cogs of one another in the flow that feeds one and the same desiring machine. So many local flares patiently kindled for a generalized explosion. I think that one of the things that they're thinking about is, in a book that's supposedly against psychoanalysis, even in a chapter on psychoanalysis, why so much literary and artistic reference? Why so much literary and artistic material? And I think that for them, it's not about what the literature means, right? It is that that literature and art can have these ways of recreating the world ways, and that's part of their liberatory and revolutionary aspect in and of themselves, when they are when they can affect nations individually and socially. So to leave out literature and art from this book would be to really not do justice to what they mean by schizophrenia as a process, right? And to leave out Artaud from this book itself would, then you don't even have the notion of a body without organs, which I think Artaud uses it as his own way. Deleuze uses it, has his own conception of it. He said that sometimes he and Guattari never really agreed on certain terms, one of them being the body without organs. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's kind of amorphous in the text and has these various functions. But in any case, I think that it points to the fact that analysis has to be transformed, but we kind of need literature and art to be able to point to why psychoanalysis is on the whole wrong about the unconscious. And that can then feed into the revolutionary machine as they see it, kind of productive ways, and not getting stuck in these old problems, or being stuck in problems that are already determined from the outset by or illegitimate conception of the unconscious, or from Oedipus's point of view. Because then I think we remain with either a reactionary or a normal, quote unquote, or the reactionary becomes the normal, and the revolutionary is foreclosed from the start.
Yeah. Are there any kind of, I mean, we opened with these, might as well finish with them as well. I guess general statements on it as whole, or the whole Holy Family chapter. But thank you for going through the whole thing here with me.
Hey, no problem.
I know it is a lot at once, and
Yeah.
and after going through it twice, I realized I should have done 2 reading groups. It would have been really helpful to do 2 reading group sections for this. What is it? 88-page chapter.
Yeah, it's a fairly long chapter, and I believe, when Coop and I did it, we cut it in half. Just to
Maybe 3. I
be able
don't
to
know if
focus.
it's 2 or 3
We may have.
seminars.
Yeah, we may have. I will say, just to reiterate kind of what I mentioned about art, they say Artaud makes a shambles of psychiatry precisely because he is schizophrenic and not because he is not. Artaud is a fulfillment of literature precisely because he is a schizophrenic and he is not. So I think that if we remember this type of statement, then we can kind of see what they mean by schizophrenia as a process and not as a medical diagnosis.
Yeah.
That it's in that's where, and we'll see later that sort of capitalism and schizophrenia do, and that's the subtitle of the 2-volume
both books. Yeah.
We will see how capitalism and schizophrenia have a certain resemblance. It's just an appearance, but they have a resemblance insofar as decoding is concerned. So that's something to look forward, perhaps in chapter 3, and something to keep in mind when they talk about schizophrenia. We need to keep it in line with schizophrenia as a process, as a creative process that decodes and that sort of pushes the wall. But capitalism will decode and it will push the wall, but it'll always reinstitute a kind of limit, right? It's always going to push those limits. It's going to reinstitute one. Whereas I think for Deleuze and Guattari, schizophrenia is not interested in this type of displacement. Because it's not concerned with reappropriating surplus value. But I'm just leaving to maybe give
a teaser trailer
that lead to the next chapter,
like a post-credit scene.
Right.
Yeah. But I think.
What about you? Do you want to have some final thoughts?
It is. I'm just glad I was able to go through this, especially with someone as, I guess, well read on this as you. This is the hardest chapter. It's also the one that kind of passed me by on my first reading. It is helpful for me now to know more about Freud and Spinoza, particularly while going through this chapter. The next one, I know I'm doing it in that chapter 3 is split into 2. It's everything up to capitalism, and then it's the capitalism sections. So everything between the inscribing socius and the Erstat, and then the chapters after that. Those are the sections 3 and 4 for this reading group. Gosh, I don't know what I can finish on for what I haven't already said to some degree.
It's no problem. I mean, we have said a good deal, so
it is 3 hours worth of content here. So, but I do think for this reading group specifically, I have been able to kind of, even if I still have to think it over a little bit, I understand how these concepts can relate to the project that I've set myself up for. Because I kind of I started with a shot in the dark, and I'm slowly over the next, I don't know, 10 or so months having to turn the lights on and figure out where I'm actually aiming for. And this specifically with what the disjunctive and conjunctive synthesis we're able to talk about, been able to kind of specify what an ethical project would be within schizoanalysis. Because I don't know how much you view my tweets, but I'm the weird guy who defines morals as like the repressive codes and ethics as like the liberatory process. Just because I like having a different definition for the two to piss people off. So I can call it what everybody else is doing is morals and what I'm doing is ethics. I can be like, I always wanted that to be a joke. It's kind of like a Zizek style joke.
Right.
I gotta have my few, even if Zizek is problematic now. But I think that's kind of what I mostly got out of this. It does, every single reading group I come out with, I guess, a better appreciation and a better understanding of these. But I guess what I particularly like, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, is that every single reading group has a different set of people, and that leads us to having, even if we're going over the same exact pages, the same exact quotes in some cases, just in completely different, I guess, understandings. We bring up completely different revelations, and rhizom's not a term yet by the time they're reading or by the time they're writing this, but it does feel like it is kind of rhizomatic reading group in this way.
Yeah. I agree. I'm glad you're doing it.
Yeah, but thank you for joining me. And you can stay on a little bit if you want to after I finish the recording. But thank you to those in the YouTube audience. If any of you somehow made it to this, I don't know, 2 hour and 55-minute mark or something, wherever we're at, please, I guess, subscribe and like to do the old thing. But thank you again for Taylor Adkins of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour for joining. And I hope you join for future sessions as well if you have the time. But if you in the YouTube video want to join, the Discord link is below. Just specify you want to join in for these discussions. This is not an easy book, by the way, as you can obviously tell. But thank you for watching.